Hey everyone, welcome back. Chapters 731 through 740 of the previous episode. Qian Ping'an travels through the war-torn Stonebrush Nation with Ma Dui and Zheng Yi, establishing kanji stalls and medicine shops to aid refugees. Along the way, he successfully coordinates the peaceful return of several female entities, including Su Xinjai, to their ancestral homes, before receiving a message via a flying sword from Lu Laocheng. Balancing the dual demands of fist and qi refinement, Qian Ping'an remains calm and meticulous, subtly reshaping the power dynamics of Bamboo Scroll Lake, while advancing his master plan to protect his friends and uphold his principles. If possible, you can support me via PayPal, or become a channel member to help me keep this channel running. Thank you. Now let's get back to the story of Sword of Coming audio series. Chapter 741. Ma Dui and Zheng Yi stopped at the foot of the mountain ridge and waited for a long time. Yet there was still no sign of Qian Ping'an turning around and returning with his horse. Ma Dui started to become a little worried, and it was surprisingly Zheng Yi, whom she had blocked just then, who remained calm and composed. Ma Dui was most annoyed about Zheng Yi being a stupid person who has stupidly good luck, and him not realizing how lucky he was. She chuckled in anger and huffed. What a heartless person you are. Feeling carefree and relaxed after eating and drinking your fill. Zheng Yi was just an expressionless young boy who was timid and inarticulate, so he didn't dare to talk back to Ma Dui. Most importantly, he didn't feel that Ma Dui's criticism of him was incorrect. Ma Dui was just about to say something else. However, Qian Ping'an descended from the mountain ridge at this moment, and his expression appeared a little different in the eyes of Ma Dui and Zheng Yi. He no longer looked troubled and gloomy, and he instead looked a little happy. Ma Dui exchanged a glance with Zheng Yi. Qian Ping'an grabbed his sword nurturing gourd and took a swig of wine, saying with a faint smile, "Let's keep going." The three steeds continued north along the meandering roads. There was thick snow blanketing the roads and surroundings, and the snow melted so slowly that it was almost impossible to see any greenery amid the mountains and rivers. However, there was finally a hint of warmth from the sun. Zheng Yi was able to see and hear many things on the journey, and he finally came across the famous border scouts of the Great Li Empire. The scouts were suited in battle-worn armor and armed with bows and sabers, and the cavalrymen didn't appear arrogant or haughty, nor did they radiate with any killing intent. Rather, they were like a flowing river under ice, silent and slow. The scouts only observed them for a brief moment before rushing past. Zheng Yi's heart was in his throat, and he only dared to breathe again after the scouts were dozens of paces away from them. They also came across an endless stream of large convoys hastily traveling north, with all of the carriages exquisite and everyone fearing for their own safety, from the guards to the chariot drivers and to the passengers who occasionally pulled back their curtains to peer at the three steeds. Zheng Yi saw Mr. Chen stopping his horse by the side of the road, and only when the convoys passed did he continue forward. Afterward, they saw a small box roll along the ground, one that the owner had no time to stop and retrieve. Qian Ping'an jumped off his horse and opened the small box, finding that it was filled with ancient books. Casually grabbing one and flipping it open, he saw several book stamps belonging to different dynasties and using different scripts. This represented the previous owners of the book. Qian Ping'an held the small box and looked backward, thinking for a moment before deciding against returning it. He temporarily placed it in his minimization treasure before jumping on his horse and continuing forward. Ma Dui looked for a conversation, saying in amusement, "Oh? I didn't think that you were this type of person. Are you going to steal the books just like that?" Zheng Yi rebutted Ma Dui in a rare display, saying, "These items were abandoned by their previous owner, and their books of all things as well. Perhaps you want us to leave them in the mud to get soiled?" Qian Ping'an shook his head and said, "They're in the process of fleeing for their lives, so us delaying them for even a second could lead to unpredictable consequences." Zheng Yi shot a glance at Ma Dui. Ma Dui rolled her eyes in response. Afterward, a female entity who had temporarily resided in a fox-skin beauty talisman entered the living world and used her slightly rusty local dialect to ask for information in a small prefectural city that hadn't been transformed into a battleground. After asking many people, she finally found a residence with a tall and impressive front door. The four of them then settled down in a local inn, and Qian Ping'an put away the fox-skin beauty talisman at night before quietly sneaking inside. He then retrieved the talisman and allowed the female entity to enter the living world again, giving her an opportunity to finally see that handsome scholar who had traveled to the capital to participate in the imperial examination back then. The scholar was already an old man closing in on 50, and he was carrying his young and snoozing son in his arms as he drank with a few good friends from the officialdom. They were engaged in spirited discussions, and his friends congratulated him again and again, saying that he had obtained fortune from misfortune. The scholar had become acquainted with a military officer from the Great Li Empire, allowing him to become the third in command in this small prefectural city. His friends joked and said that he shouldn't forget about them after becoming wealthy and powerful, causing the old scholar who was yet to don his brand new official garb to roar with hearty laughter. The female entity appeared a little downcast, and it seemed as if she could barely recognize the scholar who had been her childhood sweetheart. Perhaps it was because he was no longer young. The female entity walked along a quiet street with Chen Ping'an after leaving the residence. "That child looks more like his father, what do you think?" Chen Ping'an suddenly asked. The female entity nodded and immediately cheered up, exclaiming, "I think you're right." Chen Ping'an, Ma Dui, and Zheng Yi left the small prefectural city that the heavy cavalry of the Great Li Empire didn't care about at all, continuing on their journey north. They arrived in a small county city where they decided to dismount and buy some miscellaneous goods. Chen Ping'an walked past a relatively big gold and silver shop, and he hesitated for a moment before turning back and walking inside. There were 2 old shop attendants and 2 young shop attendants, with all of them busy with their own tasks. Chen Ping'an retrieved an official gold ingot of the Stone Brush Nation, and exchanged it for some official silver and a pile of copper coins. The 2 old and experienced shop attendants didn't participate in the transaction, allowing their young disciples to deal with the matter. After all, one's master could only teach one the basics, and it was up to one's talent and hard work to decide how far one could eventually go. When raising children, parents would hope that their children could look after them in old age. In a similar vein, masters would naturally want their disciples to be deft and capable such that they could help around and achieve great things in the future. The 2 young shop attendants were similar in age, with one being relatively expressionless and inarticulate much like Zhang Yi. Meanwhile, the other appeared spirited and energetic, and the intelligent young boy observed Chen Ping'an up and down twice immediately after he entered the shop. Chen Ping'an handed over the gold ingot and received some official silver and copper coins that were of slightly lesser total value. When negotiating with the young shop attendants, he first spoke using the official dialect of the luminous Vermilion Empire, causing both of them to become slightly stupefied. Chen Ping'an then spoke unfluently using the official dialect of the Stone Brush Nation, and only then were they able to properly negotiate and reach a deal. Chen Ping'an left the shop after completing the transaction. After the young man in azure cotton robes left the shop, the expressionless young boy was still immersed in the joy of earning a healthy sum of money for the shop. However, he was quickly kicked in the backside by his good friend whom he had grown up with. Following the latter's gaze, the expressionless young boy finally discovered that their masters who would argue with each other all the time were shockingly sitting together and solemnly discussing some matter. Chen Ping'an returned to Ma Dui and Zheng Yi's side, and Ma Dui asked with a smile, "This is but a small shop in a tiny county city, yet there are actually 2 qi refiners?" Chen Ping'an nodded and replied, "They're probably choosing their disciples, with each of them interested in one of the young shop attendants." Ma Dui pursed her lips and said, "The 2 elderly cultivators are at most at the abode tier, so how good a disciple can they hope to find?" Chen Ping'an smiled and replied, "If anyone were to say this, it should be me rather than you, no?" Ma Dui replied with a cold humph. Chen Ping'an hesitated for a moment before saying, "If my guess isn't wrong, then one of the elderly cultivators should be at the sea observation tier while the other has potentially reached the Dragon Gate tier. However, the 2 of them detected your presence a long time ago, so they purposely suppressed their aura and had you mistakenly believe that they were at the abode tier. As for why they didn't disguise themselves as ordinary old men from the neighborhood, it was most likely because they felt like 2 abode tier cultivators would be enough to deter powerful passers-by like us in a small rural area with little spiritual energy. At the same time, their cultivation bases wouldn't be too shocking and eyebrow-raising. Which is to say, they're both very experienced members of the cultivation world." Ma Dui's eyes lit up and she asked, "Mr. Chen, What if they stubbornly believe that we're targeting them? For example, what if they think that we're trying to steal their disciples? Mr. Chun, I feel like your act of walking inside that gold and silver shop was incorrect in and of itself. Chan Ping'an smiled and replied. And that's why outsiders like us should immediately leave after buying what we want. Also, let me say this first. Both of you should remember not to look around when we exit through the city gate in a moment. Just continue forward with your heads down, lest they start to suspect us of anything. Madui was slightly puzzled because she still didn't understand why Chan Ping'an had walked into that shop. This was quite different from Mr. Chen's normal manner of dealing with situations. Chan Ping'an told Zhang Yi to enter a shop by himself to buy some items while he and Madui waited on the street outside. He explained to Madui in a quiet voice, what if the two elderly cultivators weren't planning to recruit in-house disciples? In fact, what if they weren't official immortals and were actually heretical and sinister vagrant cultivators? So, I entered the shop to better understand the situation. The two elderly cultivators didn't look like sinister cultivators with ill intentions, and I wasn't able to gauge much more apart from this, so I simply left it at that. Madui heaved a sigh with a hint of a smile on her face as she complained, Mr. Chun, don't you find it annoying to think about so many things every day? I feel annoyed just listening to it. Thinking about these things isn't annoying to me, Chen Ping'an replied with a smile. However, I most certainly feel annoyed when I think about you shamelessly staying outside and refusing to return to the talisman day after day, forcing me to count on my fingers the number of snowflake coins that I'm wasting. How boring! Madui exclaimed in embarrassment and annoyance. Chan Ping'an smiled and put his hands inside his opposite sleeves. When Zhang Yi finished buying the miscellaneous items, Chan Ping'an told him and Madui a small and interesting piece of information, saying that the stronger Dragon Gate tier cultivator had chosen the expressionless young boy, while the weaker Sea Observation tier cultivator had chosen the intelligent young boy. These were indeed minor matters to outsiders like Chan Ping'an. To the two young boys who were temporarily oblivious to the situation, however, they would eventually understand the significance of these matters when they truly set foot on the path of cultivation in the future. This contrast between significance and insignificance had also played out following the parting between General Su Mao and Chan Ping'an. A young woodsman had coincidentally passed by and accidentally tripped on something, and he was almost shocked to death upon digging up the snow and seeing what lay underneath. Perhaps by the intangible will of the heavens, the young woodsman who was almost unable to make ends meet gritted his teeth and summoned his courage to dig up the snow in the entire area. The young woodsman was trembling with fear when he left, but there was an additional jade pendant radiating with warmth in his possession. This was a jade pendant that Prince Han Jingxin had liked to play around with, and inscribed using ancient seal script on one side were the characters Dawn Cloud Mountain, and inscribed on the other side was a Taoist mantra poem. On the path of the great Tao, unpredictable fortune and calamity doth be. A few trivial differences, yet vastly different outcomes. Chen Ping'an and his companions continued their journey, and at dawn several days later, Chen Ping'an suddenly jumped off his horse on a relatively secluded road. He left the road, venturing a dozen or so steps away before flicking his sleeve at a location that smelled strongly of blood. The snow on the ground was instantly pushed away, revealing a gruesome scene. Not only were the corpses hacked apart, but all of their organs and intestines had been dug out as well. Their deaths were incredibly brutal, and they had likely only been killed recently, no more than 1 day ago. This area should have been filled with wrathful energy, yet there wasn't a sliver of such energy. This was done by a cultivator using secret mystical techniques. Madui could barely bring herself to look, while Zhang Yi directly ran away to retch. Chan Ping'an buried the corpses further away from the road, not forgetting to piece them back together before doing so. After burying the corpses and confirming that there was no one around, Chan Ping'an retrieved the colored glazed pagoda from his minimization treasure, and let out a entity who was once a Dragon Gate tier cultivator, and had been made into a ghost general by Yu Gui following his death. The ghost general that still possessed sentience spent a long time to bring Chan Ping'an and the others to a tall mountain peak that had few inhabitants. Upon arriving at the foot of the mountain peak, Chan Ping'an summoned Madui back into a fox-skin beauty talisman before asking the ghost general to possess Zhang Yi. They started to climb the mountain, and they eventually found a mountain abode with the characters Guqin Craft, carved on a nearby cliff. The mountain and streams were beautiful, and the location of the mountain abode was furthermore like the eye of a dragon, breathing life into the entire area. However, the cultivator who had created this abode was no longer present, and the abode was now occupied by mountain ghosts and spirits. Chen Ping'an and Zi ventured into the mountain abode. Their vision opened up after 100 or so steps, and what lay before them was a large and brightly lit stone cave. There were approximately a dozen mountain spirits who were yet to fully assume human form, and there was a great demon from the mountain sitting on a tall throne. If this great demon stood up, he would probably measure 6 meters in height. His physique was like a small mountain, and he was suited in golden armor and wearing a yellow robe, with a crown sitting crookedly on his head. There were 2 beautiful and scantily clad women leaning against the throne and massaging the great demon's calves, and sitting on a sandalwood official hat chair beside the throne was a man dressed in azure robes and smiling in an amused manner. Be it the human or the demon, it was as if they were both waiting for the 2 idiots to walk into the trap by themselves. The great demon in golden armor and yellow robes had the body of a human and the head of a leopard, his true form, and he was leaning lazily against the back of his throne as he swirled a huge wine cup in his hand. When sanguine drops of wine fell to the ground, he would lightly raise a foot and step on one of the seductively beautiful women's heads, causing the latter to immediately prostrate and lick clean the wine. When they looked up again, their faces would be filled with intoxication. The man in azure turned around and gave a thumbs up, praising, "My lord, you truly possess an incredible aura, as if you're a general observing the snow through a wine glass." The great demon cracked a grin and replied, "Observe the fucking snow? Where is there snow? To say nothing of my abode, even the snow outside has long since stopped." The man in azure smiled and pointed at one of the beautiful woman's voluptuous breasts, explaining, "My lord, you simply need to look down to see the silky smooth snow, too." The great demon laughed heartily upon hearing this. The entire abode instantly became lively and loud. "Are you finished chatting?" Chen Ping'an asked. The domineering great demon narrowed his eyes and replied, "Are you in that much hurry to enter a pot of boiling oil?" Chen Ping'an nodded and replied, "Yes, I still need to make haste and continue my journey, so I am indeed in quite a bit of a hurry." The man in azure smiled and mused. "The world is gripped with chaos, so an early death can lead to an early reincarnation?" Chen Ping'an nodded again, concurring, "That makes a lot of sense." Chen Ping'an left the mountain abode with the true Zhengyi. The ghost general who chose to remain at the Guqin Craft mountain abode saw the 2 of them off to the entrance of the abode. As for what had occurred inside the stone cave in the past hour, the sea observation tier great demon in yellow robes and golden armor was as dead as could be, while the man in azure, a genuine human and the great demon strategist, had died even before the great demon. Not only that, but his soul had also been completely engulfed by the ghost general. The 2 beautiful women were also humans, and after the secret technique on them was lifted, one chose to serve the new owner of the mountain abode while the other chose to commit suicide by slamming her head into the stone wall. According to her agreement with Chen Ping'an, however, her soul was collected and allowed to stay in a room in the colored glazed pagoda previously occupied by the ghost general. As for the mountain spirits and ghosts, some were killed while some were spared. In reality, bookkeeper Chen from Cyan Gorge Island had spent less than 10 minutes executing the great demon and his minions. He had spent the rest of the time looking through their crimes and determining their punishment. "We'll return to take a look before we leave Bamboo Scroll Lake, and Zhengyi will also return to check in on the situation in the future," Chen Ping'an said to the ghost general. The ghost general nodded and replied, "I'll stay here to cultivate in peace, and I won't disturb any mortal humans. The Stonebrush Nation is engulfed in war and chaos right now, so malicious ghosts and evil spirits that are usually hard to find will definitely be more abundant." "What about 10 years later or 100 years later?" Chen Ping'an asked. The ghost general was slightly taken aback. "You should strive to become a mountain god even if you have to start off as an illegitimate mountain god not recognized by the imperial court," Chen Ping'an suggested. The ghost general felt great admiration for Chen Ping'an as he cupped his fists and replied, "I definitely won't forget the great opportunity bestowed upon me by Mr. Chen." Chen Ping'an didn't say anything else, simply descending the mountain and walking away with Zhengyi. Halfway down the mountain, Chen Ping'an retrieved a fox-skin beauty talisman and allowed Ma Dui to return to the living world. She immediately started to chat with Zhengyi. Qian Ping'an shook his head in helplessness. They continued to travel north with few stops in between, and compared to the busy official roads that they had traveled on in the southern region of the Stonebrush Nation, they were now doing their best to pick smaller roads as they ventured north. One evening, the three of them arrived at a provincial city just as the city gates were about to close, hurriedly making their way inside after their travel documents were carefully scrutinized by the strict guards. This important and injury-riddled provincial city in the north had already been conquered by the heavy cavalry of the Great Li Empire, but the Great Li Empire hadn't left behind too many troops to guard the city, with only 100-odd cavalrymen. To say nothing of guarding the city, there weren't enough troops to even guard the city gates. In addition to this, there was only a group of scholarly secretaries accompanying the troops as well as some martial secretaries responsible for protecting them. After entering the city, Qian Ping'an and his companions wandered through almost half of the city before finally finding a small inn to stay at. The reason for this was very simple. Firstly, the intense battle had only just finished, and the city was yet to recover from the large number of deaths and injuries. Afterward, there had also been serious incidents of assassins attempting to kill scholarly officials of the Great Li Empire. Secondly, it was going to be New Year's Eve in 2 days. The vitality of the city was very low to begin with, meaning that business was naturally very bad. Add to that the new year, and it could be said that Qian Ping'an and his two companions were already very fortunate to find a place to stay. The next day, Zhengyi was possessed by a male entity, and he led Qian Ping'an to a force in the cultivation world that was based inside the provincial city. This force was only third-rate in the cultivation world of the Stonebrush Nation, but to the local residents of the provincial city, it was still a lofty and indomitable existence. The malign entity was a local resident before death, and both he and his older sister had depended on each other to make ends meet. However, the son of the powerful force's leader took a fancy to his sister, and in the end, both she and her fiancé, an impoverished scholar with no fame and success, were found drowned to death in a river one day. Her clothes were disheveled, yet who dared to take another glance at a corpse floating in the river? Her fiancé had suffered an even worse fate, and it appeared as if his legs had been broken before he was drowned to death. Afterward, a young boy had spent all of his savings to bury his older sister and her fiancé, whom he already viewed as his brother-in-law. He had then secretly left the provincial city, wandering around before eventually arriving at Bamboo Scroll Lake and becoming an errand boy in an immortal abode. He hadn't possessed any cultivation aptitude, and he hadn't even possessed the talent to practice martial arts. Just like that, he had eventually passed away, following the footsteps of his older sister and brother-in-law. Zhang Yi stood in front of a large door, above which the plaque had already been changed. The malign entity had already been downcast and dejected when walking over, and this discovery made him appear even more despondent. The tragedy that changed his life had taken place 30 years ago. However, this was only a minor issue. They had asked the innkeeper for directions before leaving the inn, and the old man had sighed with emotion and said that all of the men in that clan and all of the martial artists in that force were upright and admirable heroes. However, it was a shame that good people would often suffer tragic fates, with all of them now dead. There were more than 100 men in that force, and they had resolved to guard the provincial city even if it meant death. Following their deaths, there were almost no males left in the force apart from children. There was utter agony on Zhang Ye's face, and he squatted on the ground with his hands wrapped around his head as he continually murmured, "How can this be? How can this be?" Qian Ping'an squatted down beside him, remaining calm even as Zhang Ye's expression became increasingly twisted and sinister. He simply sipped his wine in silence. Zhang Ye's eyes gradually regained clarity after a moment, and he started to sob and eventually ended up with his head lowered and his hands on the ground. He breathed heavily, and he was already unable to cry anymore. Only then did Qian Ping'an open his mouth and say, "I feel like I was in a similar state to you when I was at my lowest point. I felt like I was a dog or even inferior to a dog. At the end of the day, however, we're still humans." Qian Ping'an smiled pitifully and continued, "Of course, I pushed through it in the end. Even though I don't eat shit, I was able to enjoy a lot of bullshit fortune. I was much more fortunate than you." Zhang Yi panted heavily, sitting down on the ground and extending a hand as he asked, "Mr. Qian, can I drink some of your wine? I've never drank any wine in my life. Qian Ping'an offered his sword-nurturing gourd to the malign entity and replied, "There's more than enough wine for you. The only potential issue is whether you can handle so much wine." Zhang Yi reared his head and took a huge swig, following which he immediately broke into a fit of violent coughing. His entire body trembled, and he was just about to hand the wine gourd back to Qian Ping'an. However, Qian Ping'an had already retracted his hands and placed them inside his opposite sleeves, squatting there as if he were a most ordinary resident of the provincial city. It was as if he were sunbasking on a warm and sunny winter's day. He shook his head and suggested, "Why don't you take another swig? Perhaps you'll understand the joy of drinking wine once you become accustomed to the taste." Sure enough, Zhang Yi raised the wine gourd and took another swig. However, he frowned deeply before wiping his mouth and shaking his head, saying, "I still don't like the taste." Qian Ping'an accepted the sword-nurturing gourd, taking a swig of wine himself before retying the wine gourd to his waist. Zhang Yi sat on the ground and took a glance at the residents, with his expression becoming pained once again. He wanted to speak several times, yet he swallowed his words each time. In the end, he buried his face in his hands. Qian Ping'an turned around and asked, "What's wrong? Perhaps you want me to record the names of the people from this clan, so that they can also be included in the heavenly worship ceremony and the liberation rite of water and land in the future." He shook his head lightly and continued, "I won't agree to that. I'll write down your name, and I'll also write down the names of your older sister and your brother-in-law. However, I won't write down a single one of their names. I'm not acquainted with a single one of them after all, while I'm most definitely acquainted with you." Zhang Yi choked up and asked, "Am I very stupid?" "Yes, very stupid," Qian Ping'an replied with a nod. Zhang Yi wiped away his tears, with his expression becoming determined as he said, "A good-for-nothing like me doesn't have the face to visit my older sister and my brother-in-law's graves to offer incense and wine to them. Mr. Qian, can you please pay respect to them and offer them incense and wine in my stead? In any case, I've already told Mr. Qian the location of their graves, so I won't be visiting them myself." "Are you sure?" Qian Ping'an asked in a gentle voice. "You have to understand that you'll never get to make up for this in the future." Zhang Yi nodded and replied, "I'm sure." Qian Ping'an nodded in response. "Mr. Qian, when you visit their graves, can you please tell my brother-in-law that you're a friend of mine?" Zhang Yi suddenly asked. Qian Ping'an nodded and replied, "No problem." In the end, Zhang Yi insisted on kowtowing to Qian Ping'an to thank him. Qian Ping'an didn't agree to this. However, Zhang Yi insisted on doing so, saying that he wouldn't be able to depart in peace otherwise. Qian Ping'an was dazed and speechless as he looked at the young boy whose real name was Zhou Guanyin. On a small mountain ridge located several kilometers away from the provincial city, there was someone offering incense and wine in front of a small grave. The young outsider in azure cotton robes truthfully recounted the events to the grave, even revealing the fact that Zhou Guanyin had asked him to pretend to be his friend. In the end, Qian Ping'an looked at the small grave mound and said in a soft voice, "For you to have a little brother like him, for you to have a brother-in-law like him, and for me to have a friend like Zhou Guanyin, this is a most wonderful thing." Late at night, inside the inn in the provincial city, it was dinner time on New Year's Eve. The three guests didn't spend any money to eat New Year's Eve dinner at the inn, causing the innkeeper to feel slightly disappointed. Qian Ping'an simply asked the innkeeper for a stove and a bag of charcoal, and Ma Duyi and the downcast Zhang Yi accompanied him all the way until midnight. There was no chatter as they sat around the stove. Afterward, Ma Duyi and Zhang Yi returned to their respective rooms. Sitting in a foreign nation, Qian Ping'an stayed up by himself until the next morning. Another year passed just like that. According to the traditions of the small town from the Jewel Small World, every family needed to place their brooms upside down on the first day of the new year. One shouldn't embark on distant travel either. Qian Ping'an asked Ma Duyi to guide Zhang Yi in his cultivation. The three of them had become quite familiar with each other after traveling together for the past while, so after some consideration, Qian Ping'an had decided to hand the paper recording the secret ghost cultivation technique to Ma Duyi at the end of last year. She was free to read and practice this technique, and she could ask Zhang Yi if she had any questions. They were both cultivators, but the difference in their aptitude was clear at a single glance. Ma Dui had started practicing the secret technique later than Zheng Yi, yet she was able to overtake him in no time. Barely a month had passed, yet she was already giving him advice and helping him through roadblocks. Thankfully, Zheng Yi was accustomed to this situation and didn't see anything wrong with it. Not only was he not deflated, dejected, or jealous, but he even became increasingly earnest in cultivation, striving to make up for his shortcomings through hard work. Chen Ping'an was quite happy about this. Being able to accept fate but also daring to challenge fate was a very valuable trait for cultivators to have. As long as Zheng Yi persisted, it wouldn't be a wild wish for him to become a late bloomer and achieve great success later in life. Chen Ping'an was sun-basking in the quiet and deserted courtyard of the inn today, and he opened up the bookcase that had been dropped by the fleeing convoy, recording each book that was inside. He thought to himself that if the opportunity arose in the future, he would ask Zheng Yi to return these books to their original owners. The stamps in the books all contain 2 stamps with the characters Flowing Water Stain Clouds and Rugged Old Man, so it most probably wouldn't be too difficult for Zheng Yi to follow these clues and find the scholarly clan that had fled south. Noon arrived, and Chen Ping'an received another messenger flying sword from Cyan Gorge Island, with the letter saying that there was a messenger flying sword from the Great Li Empire's Dragon Spring Prefecture waiting for him at Bamboo Scroll Lake. Because he wasn't present, the messenger flying sword could only be temporarily placed in Cyan Gorge Island's sword chamber. Lu Jimao asked Chen Ping'an what he should do, and Chen Ping'an replied with the address of his current resting, asking Island Master Lu to personally travel over to deliver the messenger flying sword. Lu Jimao arrived at the inn in the provincial city on the same night, personally handing to Chen Ping'an the messenger flying sword that had come from the formal god of the Great Li Empire's northern mountain. Chen Ping'an didn't open the messenger flying sword from Cloud Drape Mountain in front of Lu Jimao. The Island Master was a nascent tier Earth immortal with the potential to reach the upper 5 tiers, and he was also skilled in a huge number of mystical abilities. The 2 of them were only allies due to mutual benefits, and the relationship between them wasn't so good that they could treat each other as trustworthy friends. They sat opposite each other in a room in the inn. Lu Jimao didn't beat around the bush, saying frankly, "I've secretly undone the restrictions on Vermilion Cord. Residences Hong Su already according to the suggestions you made prior to your departure. However, I didn't send her to Palace Willow Island to show goodwill to Lu Laocheng. Lu Laocheng is also allied with Mr. Chan right now, and even though the friend of a friend isn't always a friend, the relationship between Cyan Gorge Island and Palace Willow Island has already thawed somewhat thanks to Mr. Chan. Tan Yuani especially paid a visit to Cyan Gorge Island, and it's clear that he's already feeling a growing sense of respect for Mr. Chan. Thus, I personally came here not only to deliver the messenger flying sword from the Great Li Empire to Mr. Chan, but also to give you a small present. Please don't refuse the present, Mr. Chan. Just treat this as a New Year's gift from Cyan Gorge Island. This has always been a tradition of Cyan Gorge Island, with each guest elder receiving a present in the first month of the new year." Chen Ping'an smiled and replied, "I'm well aware of all the rules and traditions in Cyan Gorge Island, be they old or new, major or minor. As such, I would have spoken up and reminded Island Master Lu even if you didn't bring me a present." Lu Jimao retrieved a walnut bracelet that looked slightly loose, appearing as if it had been neglected for many years, and was now missing almost half of the walnut beads. There were only 8 walnut beads engraved with the images of rain gods, lightning gods, and other deities remaining, with each as big as a thumb. The walnut beads radiated with an ancient aura, and each of the portraits of the primordial deities was spirited and lifelike. Lu Jimao smiled faintly and explained, "You simply need to remove a bead and throw it to the ground to summon either wind, rain, lightning, fire, or some other power. The might released by a ruptured walnut bead will be equivalent to the full power strike of an ordinary golden core tier Earth immortal. However, the walnut beads will be destroyed after use, so this immortal treasure can't be regarded as a very good one. Even so, Mr. Chun is wounded right now, so it's not ideal for you to clash with others too often. In this sense, this treasure is indeed very suitable for Mr. Chun." Chen Ping'an accepted the walnut bracelet and carefully put it in his sleeve, saying in gratitude, "That's indeed the case. Thank you for your kindness, Island Master Lu." Lu Jimao smiled faintly and continued, 3 things took place recently that shocked the luminous Vermilion Empire, as well as all of its vassal states. Firstly, the 9th-tier sword cultivator who was hiding in Bamboo Scroll Lake was chased more than 500 kilometers away by a young woman in green and a young man in white, and in the end, they worked together to kill the powerful sword cultivator. The young woman in green was none other than the nameless cultivator who had destroyed the ancestral hall of Hibiscus Mountain during the meeting between island masters on Palace Willow Island, and it's rumored that she's actually a sticky rod official of the Great Li Empire. As for the young man in white who suddenly appeared from out of nowhere, he possessed extraordinary Dao power and owned a myriad of immortal treasures. He appeared calm and leisurely while chasing his foe, while on the other hand, the 9th-tier sword cultivator appeared extremely disheveled in comparison. Lu Jimao smiled and looked at Chen Ping'an after saying this. What did Oriole Island say? Chen Ping'an asked. The Earth Immortal couple from Oriole Island immediately paid a visit to Tan Yuani after hearing the news, asking him for protection. It can be said that they've comprehensively sided with the Great Li Empire, Lu Jimao replied. This is good news, Chen Ping'an said with a nod. Secondly, Great General Su Gaoshan announced that he would breach the capital of the Stonebrush Nation before the Lantern Festival on the 15th, Lu Jimao continued. He further said that those who are unwilling to accompany the Imperial Han clan of the Stonebrush Nation in death simply need to plaster the door gods of the Great Li Empire's Chao clan and Yuan clan to their front doors before this date. This only applies to the families and clans with officials and nobles, and they can avoid any conflict if they comply with this. When the heavy cavalry of the Great Li Empire breaches the capital, those who refuse to comply will all be viewed as remnant evil on the side of the Imperial Han clan. As for the ordinary residents of the capital, they simply need to put up the door gods of the Great Li Empire within 3 days of the capital falling to avoid being viewed as enemies. Those who don't have the door gods of the Great Li Empire displayed on their front doors after this date will be remembered and punished in the future. To strategize first and to attack the psyche of the enemy, Chen Ping'an commented softly. There was a look of amusement in Lu Jimao's eyes as he continued. As for the third matter, it would have been regarded as quite significant if the world were enjoying peace and prosperity right now. However, it's nowhere near as eye-catching in the current climate. Prince Han Jingxin, the most pampered son of the Stonebrush Nation's emperor, was violently killed in a desolate rural area. His corpse was incomplete, and guest elder Zheng of the imperial family was nowhere to be found. Hu Han, the #1 martial artist of the Stonebrush Nation, was also found beheaded. It's rumored that Su Mao, the lance-wielding poet, offered the heads of Prince Han Jingxin and Hu Han as pledges of loyalty to General Su Gaoshan of the Great Li Empire on a windy and snowy night. Following this, he was promoted to the position of Imperial General, a 4th-rank position in the Imperial Court of the Great Li Empire. It's not an exaggeration to say that he ascended to the heavens in a single step. In any case, it seems truly difficult to obtain military merit in the army of the Great Li Empire nowadays. Lu Jimao retrieved 2 wine bowls and placed them on the table. Chen Ping'an smiled and grabbed his sword-nurturing gourd, upon which Lu Jimao tactfully put away one of the wine bowls. He clearly knew that Chen Ping'an wouldn't use his wine bowl, but he needed to at least follow the rules of the drinking table. Chen Ping'an poured a bowl of wine for Lu Jimao before drinking from the sword-nurturing gourd himself. After taking a swig of wine, Chen Ping'an said slowly, "There's no need to be suspicious, Island Master Lu. I was the one who killed them both. As for their heads being hacked off, that was the doing of Su Mao. I didn't kill Su Mao, and Su Mao became the scapegoat for me. We both obtained what we wanted." Lu Jimao laughed heartily and continued, "The Stonebrush Nation isn't big, but it isn't exactly small either. To charge directly onto the tip of Mr. Chen's sword, it has to be said that Han Jingxin was fated never to become emperor. Truth be told, however, the emperor of the Stonebrush Nation had the highest hopes for Han Jingxin out of all of his sons. Han Jingxin was the shrewdest and most calculating among the princes, and his fated opportunities were initially very good as well. However, it was a shame that he insisted on seeking death. Nothing could have saved him. Island Master Lu, there's one matter that I haven't been able to understand this entire time. The luminous Vermilion Empire has many vassal states, of which the Stonebrush Nation is one, but why are all of them choosing to oppose the Great Li Empire with their entire might?" Chen Ping'an asked. As vassal states to a powerful empire in the eastern treasured Vile continent, It doesn't make sense for them to be so stubborn and loyal, and it's abnormal for the opposition voices in the imperial courts to be so muted. Starting from the Yellow Court Nation, a vassal state of the Great Sui Nation, to the entire northern region of the eastern treasured Vile continent lying to the north of Lakeview Academy. Qian Ping'an tapped the table with his fingers and continued, "Only this matter doesn't make any sense." Lu Jimao hesitated for a moment before drinking a sip of wine and explaining slowly, "The 100 schools of thought each have their own wagers. Even though the eastern treasured Vile continent is small, the imperial Song clan of the Great Li Empire was able to obtain the support of the main Mahist branch, the naturalists, the militarians from True Martial Mountain, and so on. Since these forces chose the Great Li Empire, it's not surprising that other main branches and side branches of the 100 schools of thought have chosen to support the luminous Vermilion Empire, the most powerful empire in the central region of the eastern treasured Vile continent. According to my limited knowledge, the agriculturalists, the medicinists, the commercialists, and the diplomatists are all providing strong support to the luminous Vermilion Empire. The luminous Vermilion Empire is brimming with sword cultivators, and it can be said that the fortune of the empire is flourishing right now. They also have a close relationship with Lakeview Academy, so it's completely understandable that the heavy cavalry of the Great Li Empire is currently stuck here." Qian Ping'an came to a sudden realization, and he raised his sword nurturing gourd, following which Lu Jimao also raised his wine bowl, with the two of them drinking together. Lu Jimao was dressed in white, with his clothes seemingly simple as if he were an impoverished hermit living in the mountains. Looking carefully, however, he radiated with an impressive immortal aura. Qian Ping'an suddenly sighed with emotion and remarked, "Before I knew it, I almost forgot that Island Master Lu is also a nascent tier cultivator." Lu Jimao drank slowly and leisurely, looking out the window at the thick snow on the roof ridges as he smiled faintly and replied, "Before I knew it, I also almost forgot that Mr. Qian was born and raised in Clay Vase Alley." Qian Ping'an suddenly leaned forward, holding out his sword nurturing gourd and causing Lu Jimao to falter for a moment. However, Lu Jimao quickly came to his senses and lightly clinked his wine bowl with Qian Ping'an's wine gourd. Qian Ping'an took a large and satisfying swig of wine, with his expression serious as he said, "I was wrong before. The two of us are indeed 50% like-minded with each other. This has got nothing to do with whether we're friends or foes." Lu Jimao retracted his wine bowl, looking to be in no hurry to drink as he looked intently at the young man in azure cotton robes. Qian Ping'an was becoming increasingly haggard, and only his eyes, which had been extremely bright and limpid before, were becoming deeper and deeper. However, they weren't becoming dark and murky, nor were they becoming sinister and calculating. Lu Jimao downed the remaining wine in his bowl before standing up and saying, "I won't stay any longer and delay Mr. Qian from attending to proper matters. If the situation in Bamboo Scroll Lake can be improved, the two of us don't need to dream about becoming friends in the future, but we can at least hope to sit down together and drink wine when we meet again. We can drink and chat to our heart's content before bidding farewell. We can then do the same when we next meet again. That's all there is to it." Qian Ping'an shook his head and replied, "We already bade farewell at Bamboo Scroll Lake, and once Island Master Lu advances to the upper 5 tiers and enters that vastly different world, it's likely that Island Master Lu won't be in the mood to entertain such matters anymore. Mr. Chen's cultivation of the mind is progressing in leaps and bounds, so at that time, it's entirely possible that Mr. Qian won't possess the same mental state as today either." Lu Jimao chuckled in reply. "What a like-minded person," the two of them remarked in unison. After Lu Jimao left, Ma Duyi and Zheng Yi were filled with trepidation as they entered the room and sat down. Lu Jimao hadn't used his Earth Immortal mystical powers to create a barrier and keep secret his conversation with Qian Ping'an, nor had he purposely held back on saying anything. As a result, Ma Duyi and Zheng Yi had been able to vaguely hear the chatter and laughter coming from the room. There was a complicated look in Ma Duyi's eyes. Meanwhile, there was a look of puzzlement on Zheng Ye's face. Qian Ping'an didn't explain anything, and he simply asked Zheng Yi about his cultivation progress, answering each of the young boys' questions, and occasionally providing some guidance or inspiration when they discussed more intricate specifics. Even though Ma Duyi and Zheng Yi were cultivating together and pushing each other forward, with the former even able to answer questions for the latter, Ma Duyi was still slightly lacking compared to Qian Ping'an. At the very least, this was what Qian Ping'an felt. However, when Qian Ping'an's seemingly bland and ordinary words entered Ma Dui's ears, the young woman who was more talented than Zheng Yi was struck by inspiration after inspiration. It was as if an immortal had led them to a waterfall, where both she and Zhang Yi could only stand at the foot of the waterfall and catch water with bowls and buckets to quench their thirst. Only after Ma Dui and Zheng Yi took their leave did Qian Ping'an undo the restriction on the messenger flying sword from the Great Li Empire's cloud-draped mountain. It was an unexpected piece of news. An assistant minister from the Great Li Empire's Ministry of Rites had personally visited Dragon Spring Prefecture, and apart from inspecting matters pertaining to the Scholarly Temple and the Martial Sage Temple, he had privately visited mountain god Weibo as well, offering a new suggestion during their conversation. The imperial court of the Great Li Empire had recently bought back many mountains abandoned by the immortal forces, so they were planning to use this opportunity to do some big business with Qian Ping'an. The Great Li Empire still owed Qian Ping'an some gold essence copper coins, so Qian Ping'an could use these coins to buy the so-called mature mountains that already had immortal abodes and mountain protection formations left behind by the immortal forces. If Qian Ping'an agreed to this proposal, he could obtain close to 30% of the mountains to the west of Dragon Spring Prefecture in one fell swoop. Disregarding the abundance of spiritual energy in these mountains and only focusing on their sizes, Qian Ping'an would become a big landlord who could almost rival Sage Ruan Qiong. Weibo was very frank in the letter, saying that this was a hugely beneficial opportunity for Qian Ping'an. However, there were some notable risks involved in the sense that Qian Ping'an's ties to the Great Li Empire would become deeper and stronger. It wouldn't be easy for him to wash his hands of this relationship in the future, and he wouldn't be able to simply sell his mountains as Light Breeze City's Su clan had done so if things took a turn for the worst. The imperial court of the Great Li Empire had also listed out some conditions, saying that Qian Ping'an would need to sign a special contract if he were to own so much land in Dragon Spring Prefecture. Cloud Drape Mountain, the northern mountain of the nation, would be the location where they formed their alliance, and the imperial court of the Great Li Empire, Weibo, and Qian Ping'an would sign together a second Great Alliance contract of the empire. First Great Alliance contracts involved the formal gods of the five mountains appearing together, and such contracts also needed to be stamped with the imperial seal of the emperor. Of course, such important contracts would only be signed with upper five-tier cultivators who could influence the fortune of the nation. Only then would the Great Li Empire go to such great lengths. Weibo also said frankly that Qian Ping'an could consider his relationship and trust in Weibo when contemplating whether to sign this alliance contract or not. However, this consideration should only play a small role in his final decision. One needed to be extremely diligent and cautious when it came to matters pertaining to the Great Tao. At the end of the secret letter, Weibo said that this matter wasn't urgent and he could help Qian Ping'an delay things for another 6 months to 1 year, so he could have a good think about it. Even if the state of affairs in the Eastern Treasured Vial continent was much clearer at that time, with the Great Li Empire having defeated the luminous Vermilion Empire and continued their expedition south, it was simply a case of the middleman, Weibo, and the buyer, Qian Ping'an, needing to be a little more shameless in pushing to sign an alliance contract with the Great Li Empire. This was very normal when doing business in the mountains and outside the mountains, so there was no need for Qian Ping'an to feel troubled or embarrassed. After reading the secret letter, Qian Ping'an opened his small sword resting ground and used a messenger flying sword to send a message to Lu Jimao. Afterward, Island Master Lu could help him deliver a letter to Cloud Drape Mountain, and the reply only needed to be a single word. Okay. With this done, Qian Ping'an walked to the window and looked outside. General Su Mao from the Stonebrush Nation was wildly ambitious, and people like him had very good chances of achieving great things and rising to high positions in chaotic times like these. Once the Great Li Empire defeated the luminous Vermilion Empire and continued to march south, Su Mao, who was already a middle-rank martial official in the Great Li Empire, would be able to command a squad of elite cavalry, making him even stronger. As the army marched south, that would present Su Mao with the opportunity to obtain huge amounts of military merit. Most importantly, Su Mao's temperament and abilities were far superior to that of Prince Han Jingxin, and all that he was lacking was an innately lofty status. It was said that Su Gaoshan had also been born in a relatively poor clan in the border regions, much the same as the Stonebrush Nation's Su Mao. As such, it was reasonable to infer that the special treatment afforded to Su Mao and his quick promotion to a martial official was related to this fact. Su Mao would have also been rewarded if he had defected to General Chaoping, the other great general from a pillar clan in the Great Li Empire, but he most definitely wouldn't have enjoyed a direct promotion to the position of 4th-rank martial official. Perhaps he would have also been valued and promoted to important positions in the future, but the speed of his rise up the ranks would have definitely been slower. Chen Ping'an passed many county cities and prefectural cities during his journey north, and the heavy cavalry under Su Gaoshan's command naturally hadn't been perfect and faultless. However, the many military rules of the Great Li Empire's armies were still vaguely noticeable. For example, loyal members of the Stonebrush Nation had attempted to assassinate a scholarly attendant of the Great Li Empire in Zhou Guanyan's hometown, that rundown provincial city, and the Great Li Empire had rapidly deployed a squad of elite cavalry as reinforcement. Working together with the cultivators accompanying the army, they had caught and executed all of the main culprits, hanging their heads on the city walls. Meanwhile, several high-ranking accomplices from the Stonebrush Nation were imprisoned, with their clan members also placed under house arrest. However, there was no unnecessary implication or punishment. Something else also occurred during this time, something that made Chen Ping'an look at Su Gaoshan in a new light. One windy and snowy night, a young boy secretly snuck onto the city wall to steal the head of his respected master. He was discovered by the guards on the city wall, yet he still managed to escape. However, it wasn't long before the young martial artist was caught by 2 martial secretaries of the Great Li Empire. This matter could be viewed as either major or minor, especially since it was a crime with no precedent during the Great Li Empire's expedition to the south. It was reported up through the ranks, eventually catching the attention of General Su Gaoshan. Su Gaoshan instructed his subordinates to bring the young martial artist to the general's tent, and after having a conversation with him, Su Gaoshan tossed him a large pouch of silver and permitted him to bury his master's whole corpse. His only request was that the young martial artist should remember that the true culprit behind his master's death was Su Gaoshan, so he wasn't allowed to cause trouble for the border army of the Great Li Empire in the future, especially trouble for the scholarly officials. If the young martial artist wanted to exact revenge in the future, then he should directly look for Su Gaoshan. Word of this matter spread far and wide through the officialdom and cultivation world in the central region of the Stonebrush Nation. Following this was the first major matter that Lu Jimao had mentioned, the young woman in green and the young boy in white. Chen Ping'an smiled upon thinking of this. A thought suddenly occurred to Chen Ping'an, and he jumped onto the windowsill before lightly tapping his foot and leaping onto the ridge of the roof. He walked forward slowly, with no destination in his mind. He was simply taking a stroll along the many roof ridges. The sword nurturing gourd was still on the table, and he hadn't taken the bamboo saber and the great replica Chu Huang with him either. He was doing as he pleased without overstepping the boundaries. He could go anywhere he wanted in the vast heaven and earth. In the end, Chen Ping'an stopped and stood on the curved eaves of a roof, closing his eyes and starting to practice standing meditation. However, he didn't maintain this practice for a long time, and he instead pricked up his ears to listen to the sound of melting snow. Perhaps this person was a martial secretary from the Great Li Empire stationed at this city, or perhaps they were an accompanying cultivator from some mountain in the Great Li Empire. Of course, it was also possible that they were a cultivator from True Martial Mountain, an ancestral temple of the Militarian sect. This was a young man wearing light armor, and he was also walking along the roof ridges in the city. He had nothing to do today, and he wasn't technically a member of the army either, so he held a pot of wine that he had warmed up beforehand as he stopped on a curved eave several dozen paces away from Chen Ping'an. Using the official dialect of the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent, he smiled and said, "Enjoying the scenery is okay, and even visiting the city wall of the provincial city will be fine. I coincidentally came here to relax my mind as well, so I can accompany you if that suits you." This was a very polite introduction, and following the unstoppable advance of the Great Li Empire's heavy cavalry, everyone and everything that wasn't from the Great Li Empire could indeed be viewed as an outsider and a vassal. However, there was also a sense of alertness in the young cultivator's words. Chen Ping'an smiled and shook his head, replying, "There's no need, I'm just about to return." The young cultivator was astounded, but he immediately broke into loud laughter, raising his pot of wine high into the air. As it turned out, the young man in azure cotton robes had spoken fluently using the official dialect of the Great Li Empire. And thus, the marshal secretary, who was young yet had already fought on horseback for close to 10 years, said in a loud voice, "I'm Guan Yiran from E Province's Cloud Stay Prefecture." There was hesitation on Qian Ping'an's face, especially since now wasn't a suitable time to reveal his identity. As such, he simply smiled in apology and cupped his fists in acknowledgement. Guan Yiran laughed loudly and said, "If you come across any difficulties in the future, you can seek help from the heavy cavalry of the Great Li Empire. Wherever our cavalry exists is wherever the territory of the Great Li Empire extends to." Qian Ping'an appeared slightly adrift, not knowing how to respond. The third day of the new year arrived, and Qian Ping'an left the provincial city with Ma Dui and Zheng Yi, continuing their journey toward the northern border of the Stonebrush Nation. The thick snow gradually melted away. Spring ushered in lush greenery. The sunshine glistened on the flourishing locust leaves. Zheng Yi obtained many treasures as they traveled, for example, a military seal of a martial official from the Stonebrush Nation that was inscribed with the characters, crafted by Li Chao. There were also many antiques and curios that had been randomly tossed aside like trash, with most of them being large vessels or small and exquisite items. It was very likely that the ordinary-sized items easy for carrying around had already been taken away by the fleeing commoners. Many of the abandoned items would be worth dozens or even 100 gold coins during peacetime. Yet they were now strewn across the ground like worthless rubbish. There were renowned and expensive works of calligraphy and paintings that were already soaked and damaged by mud, and precious treasures that had been sold at a bargain to those shops in the cities that hadn't been ravaged by the flames of war. Ma Dui was an avaricious person, and Zheng Yi was surprisingly even more so. Whenever they had free time after setting up the kanji stalls and medicine shops, the two of them would run around the city to look for cheap treasures. They had already borrowed money from Qian Ping'an 2 times, but it was only a small amount in total, adding up to just 12 snowflake coins. However, it wasn't easy to exchange this into mortal gold and silver, and it was necessary to visit immortal ferry stations or immortal inns to do so. Thankfully, one of the female entities staying in the foxskin beauty talismans hailed from a relatively powerful first-rate immortal force in the Stonebrush Nation. After helping her complete her final wish, Qian Ping'an exchanged some immortal coins for mortal gold and silver with the immortal force. He then gave the gold and silver to Ma Dui and Zheng Yi, letting them spend it as they saw fit. Regarding this, Ma Dui had especially pestered Qian Ping'an to make a large bamboo case for her, so that she would have somewhere to store the money. Qian Ping'an had no objections to this, and he afforded them great freedom as long as this didn't delay their cultivation and negatively affect their focus on proper matters. They were in a small prefectural city near the border today, and after Qian Ping'an met with the local officials, Zheng Yi and Ma Dui started to adeptly make plans for the kanji stalls and medicine shops. They didn't dare to cut any corners when they worked on these matters, and only after they finished work for the day would they dare to happily visit the various shops to buy treasures for bargain prices. This was because even though Mr. Qian never became involved in the planning, nor did he ever say much at all, the two of them were already well aware of his temperament and manner of doing things after traveling with him for so long. Mr. Qian would observe and notice everything, and he would also see further and deeper than both of them. As for the many antiques and curios they bought using the money they borrowed from Mr. Qian, all of these items were temporarily placed in Mr. Chen's minimization treasure. Their ability to pick out valuable treasures was mainly thanks to Ma Dui's upbringing in a wealthy clan. She had also been responsible for managing a jewelry shop in Bamboo Scroll Lake, so it was only natural that her appraisal skills were far superior to that of Zheng Yi. As time went on, Qian Ping'an became worried that Ma Dui would also make a mistake or be tricked. After all, most of the treasures she and Zheng Yi purchased were miscellaneous items that had trickled into the hands of commoners from the wealthy clans of the Stonebrush Nation. These treasures came in all kinds of shapes and sizes. With this in mind, Qian Ping'an summoned a middle 5-tiering entity from the colored glazed pagoda, and asked him to watch over the situation for Ma Dui and Zheng Yi. However, the entity who was transformed into a guard ghost by Vermilion Court Residence's Maunji immediately became addicted to this task, even going as far as to enter a foxskin beauty talisman and appear in the world as a woman. To sacrifice so much after being a C observation tier cultivator during life, it was clear that the information recorded in Qian Ping'an's notebook was the absolute truth. This cultivator from Bamboo Scroll Lake was indeed addicted to collecting all kinds of trash antiques. Recorded in Chan Ping'an's notebook was a comment from some Earth immortal many years ago, saying that this sea observation tier cultivator who always had little money to spend would have advanced to the Dragon Gate tier long ago if it weren't for his flagrant waste of money on these treasures. Chan Ping'an also afforded great freedom to the old cultivator. Even though he was wandering around the world as a lithe beauty, he would always sit with his legs wide apart in a manner lacking in decorum. However, Chan Ping'an wasn't fazed by this, especially since he had already dealt with similar situations before. Truth be told, Du Mao acting in a feminine manner and swaying his hips as he walked had been even more repulsive. Evening arrived, and the one human and two ghosts visited the various large shops in the city to search for bargains again. The more they did this, however, the more likely it was that they would come across trouble. After all, treasures that could even attract a sea observation tier cultivator would naturally attract ordinary vagrant cultivators as well. In fact, even official immortals would purposely visit these war-torn countries and seize the opportunity to make some money. Of the heirloom treasures that many wealthy clans passed down through the generations, there would indeed be a few that the clans ignored even though they possessed sufficient spiritual energy. If one were fortunate enough to come across such treasures, it was entirely possible for one to earn dozens or even hundreds of snowflake coins. It was in this context that Zhang Yi and the others would come across like-minded cultivators. However, they had almost ended up in a conflict with some people in a large city not too long ago, with the other party being a group of official immortals from a top-notch immortal force in the Stonebrush Nation. Each side spoke their own reason and had their own merit, and neither side was acting in a domineering manner. In the end, it was still Chan Ping'an who had stepped forward and resolved the situation, telling Zhang Yi to voluntarily give up that spirit tool. The other party also took a backward stop, inviting the vagrant cultivator, Mr. Chan, to have a hearty drink and chat with them. Even so, Ma Dui still privately grumbled and complained about Chan Ping'an for a long time afterward. Chan Ping'an visited a dog meat shop in the city, and this was his second time coming here. In reality, Chan Ping'an didn't like eating dog meat at all. To be exact, he had never had dog meat in his life. However, the shop also sold other food, and the outsider who didn't eat dog meat sat by himself at a table, not drinking wine either and speaking with an accent when he used the official dialect of the Stonebrush Nation. The neighboring tables were all feasting on piping hot stewed dog meat, clinking wine cups again and again as they did so. This caused the young man in azure cotton robes to stick out like a sore thumb. Thankfully, the shop that had existed for more than 100 years and been passed down through several generations didn't discriminate against its customers. An old man worked at the counter, his son worked as the chef, and his young grandson was said to be a little scholar renowned in the nearby streets. Thus, people often joked about this shop disappearing in the future, to which the humorous old man and the expressionless chef would simply reply that this was fate and that they could do nothing about it. However, a slight sense of pride would appear on the unsmiling chef's face whenever he heard these teasing remarks. Their family was finally blessed with a smart child who had hopes of achieving success in the imperial examination in the future, so what in the world could be more fortunate than this? The world was chaotic right now, but there would eventually come a day when chaos subsided and peace returned. The dog meat shop in the alley was packed as always tonight, a reflection of their booming business. Even though the northern barbarians of the Great Li Empire had breached their city during the summer of last year, few people had died as a result, and the army of the Great Li Empire had quickly left and continued to march south. Only a few barbarians fluent in the official dialect of the Stonebrush Nation had stayed behind to oversee the officials of the prefectural city, though they seldom showed themselves in public. The lack of violence and the relatively smooth takeover by the Great Li Empire was largely thanks to the cowardice of the prefectural overseer. He had fled with his treasures and valuables, and it was said that he had even left behind his official seal. After changing into azure Confucian robes, he had fled late one night long before the arrival of the Great Li Empire's heavy cavalry, secretly leaving the city and fleeing far away under the protection of his private guards. He had directly fled south, and it was clear that he had no intention of returning to the imperial court to serve as an official. In addition, an extremely tanned and mute young boy was working as a shop attendant in the dog meat restaurant, and the skinny young boy was responsible for welcoming the customers and serving them food and water. He didn't seem clever at all. It was said that he was a refugee who had fled here from the border, and the kind-hearted owner had decided to take him in as a shop attendant. More than half a year had passed, yet the young boy was still as unlikable as always, with most of the regular customers of the shop not liking to interact with him. It was late at night, and many of the customers had already finished eating and left. However, the shop was still filled with the fragrance of dog meat. Chun Ping'an sat near the entrance and asked for a pot of local wine. The old shopkeeper was drinking with a table of regular customers, clearly drunk, with his face flushed bright red as he talked about his precious grandson. Whenever he talked about his grandson, the old man who could only drink half a liter of wine would immediately gain the ability to drink 2 or 3 times more. As he drank, he reminded himself that he couldn't charge his customers less simply because he was drunk. The world was chaotic right now, and it had become much more difficult to buy dogs regardless of whether it was in the prefectural city or in the nearby villages. There were also fewer customers than before, and the customers who visited had much less silver in their pockets. As such, it was very important for them to keep on top of the finances. They needed to spend a huge sum of money for their grandson's education, and they couldn't cheap out lest their grandson be looked down on by his classmates. Scholarly students all needed to have face. The tanned and skinny young boy was still busy with work, cleaning up a table with his back to Chun Ping'an. When Chun Ping'an finished his dishes and 2 bowls of rice, he asked for a few extra dishes of snacks to enjoy together with his wine. He didn't drink much, but his chopsticks never stopped, so it wasn't long before he almost finished the dishes of snacks as well. Chun Ping'an suddenly called the name of the tanned and skinny young boy, grabbing his attention and asking, "I need to treat a guest in a moment, so apart from free-range chickens, are there any freshly caught carp in the water vat in the backyard?" The tanned young boy nodded in silence and indifference. Chun Ping'an smiled and said, "Then tell the chef that he can start cooking. My friend will arrive when he finishes." "Oh, that's right, tell him to cook some bamboo shoot roasted pork as well." The tanned young boy nodded again, walking to the backyard and gesturing to the man who was sitting in the kitchen and resting. The man had only just sat down for a breather, so he smiled and cursed before standing up to kill a chicken and prepare a fish. He needed to work again, but which business didn't like to make money? There was a complicated expression on the tanned young boy's face as he looked at the man walking over to the water vat, and in the end, he silently left the kitchen and walked to the chicken pen to catch the largest chicken. The man laughed and scolded him, saying that he was saving this nutritious chicken for his son. Hearing this, the tanned young boy returned to the chicken pen to grab the smallest chicken. The man was still dissatisfied, saying that even if the customers didn't notice a difference in the size of the dishes, those who ran businesses still needed to remain honest and fair. He directly went to the chicken pen to grab a relatively large chicken, handing it to the tanned young boy to prepare. The young boy was quite adept at this task already. Meanwhile, the man went to catch a lively carp from the water vat. The tanned young boy shot a glance at the dog cage in the corner before quickly retracting his gaze. The first dish, braised river carp, was brought to Chun Ping'an's table. The tanned young boy saw that the customer's friend was still yet to arrive. Chun Ping'an said that he would wait for a little longer, and that his friend would arrive when the second dish was served. However, the tanned young boy saw that the customer's friend still hadn't arrived even after he served the bamboo shoot roasted pork and the onion and ginger chicken. The tanned young boy was just about to leave. However, the sickly young man in azure cotton robes suddenly smiled and said, "The dishes have all arrived, so you can sit down now." There was a baffled look on the tanned young boy's face. There was only one other table of customers left in the dog meat shop, and the old shopkeeper was already slurring his words as he continued to encourage his customers to drink. Of course, he didn't hold back on drinking either, and it was very likely that he had already forgotten about his initial thought of not giving these customers a discount. "I gather that you're already aware that I've seen through your disguise and guessed your identity," Chun Ping'an said to the tanned young boy. "At the same time, you've also guessed that I'm a cultivator. Otherwise, you wouldn't have taken a detour around me when bringing food and wine to the customers, whether intentionally or not. You wouldn't have purposely avoided my gaze either. Since this is the case, let me treat you to a meal. In any case, this is only a minor matter. The food and wine were all brought over by you, so if anyone were to be scared, it should be me instead of you. What are you afraid of?" The tanned young boy was extremely hesitant. Chun Ping'an glanced at the table in the distance and said with a faint smile, "You don't need to worry. The old shopkeeper is already drunk, and those customers are all ordinary people who won't be able to hear our conversation. The tanned young boy sat down opposite Chun Ping'an, but he didn't pick up the chopsticks to eat. Chun Ping'an picked up his chopsticks and grabbed a piece of river carp, leaning forward and placing the meat in the tanned young boy's bowl. He then grabbed some roast pork and chicken and also placed them in the tanned young boy's bowl. The tanned young boy frowned deeply as he stared at the strange outsider in front of him. Chun Ping'an grabbed himself some vegetables after doing this, scooping some rice into his mouth and chewing very carefully. He then asked, "How many people are you planning to kill?" The chef is definitely one target, and the old shopkeeper who's skilled at catching dogs is most certainly a target as well. He's bought many dogs from the markets before, and he's also stolen many dogs from the villages. So what about that little child who's still in school? Are you going to kill him as well? And what about the regular customers who always eat dog meat here? How many of them have you remembered? Are you going to kill them as well? The tanned young boy clenched his hands into fists and placed them on his knees, with his eyes ice cold and his voice low as he asked in a hoarse voice, "Are you going to stop me? What will you do if I stop you? And what will you do if I don't stop you?" Chun Ping'an retorted, "I'll dare to kill you if you dare to stop me," the tanned young boy replied in a low voice. Chun Ping'an held his chopsticks in one hand and smiled and gestured at the tanned young boy with his other hand, telling him to eat the food in his bowl first. "Let's not worry about whether your measly cultivation base is enough to kill me along with everyone else first. Why don't we eat and drink our fill before trying to fight to the death? Based on the current market price, the dishes on this table should cost at least 7 or 8 silver coins, right? And this is already because this dog meat shop is relatively fair in its pricing. If this were a restaurant on the busier streets of the prefectural city, they would probably dare to charge 1 tael of silver plus 5 silver coins for these dishes. Moreover, they would tell their customers to either pay up or piss off." The tanned young boy stared intently at Chun Ping'an's eyes. After a moment, he lowered his head and started to eat, not holding back as he grabbed meat and vegetables from the 3 dishes. If he were truly going to be vanquished by the cultivator in front of him today, then he should at least eat to his heart's content before dying. Chun Ping'an stopped eating once the young boy started to eat, and he simply poured the rest of the wine into his cup and took small sips from time to time. At the same time, he also ate the few remaining peanuts on one of the plates. After Chun Ping'an finished drinking his wine and eating the snack dishes, he placed his hands inside his opposite sleeves and sat there just like that. The tanned young boy wiped his mouth and put down his chopsticks. "I can understand your feelings and your desire to kill people upon seeing them kill dogs and eat dog meat. However, I can't accept such an outcome," Chun Ping'an said slowly. The tanned young boy chuckled coldly. "This is because you have your own principles and reasons, and you're even willing to sacrifice your life for the sake of these principles and reasons," Chun Ping'an continued. "However, I still hope that you can learn more about the world. For example, you've eaten river carp, free-range chicken, and pork in this meal, and you'll only eat more delicacies when you embark on the path of cultivation in the future. As an immortal who's partly from the mountains, you'll attend all kinds of banquets as long as you don't die. You might be the guest or you might even be the host. In any case, you'll always have enough fish and meat to eat as long as it isn't dog meat, right?" There was a dazed expression on the tanned young boy's face. "Even if I weren't here to stop you today, the cultivators accompanying the army of the Greatly Empire and overseeing this entire city would definitely hunt you down and kill you once you carried through with your plan," Chun Ping'an said slowly. "Even if you successfully flee from this prefectural city, how many dog eaters will you kill in the future? You might kill 10 or a few dozen today, so perhaps you'll kill 100 or 1,000 in the future. In any case, you won't feel any regret even if you die, am I right?" The tanned young boy lowered his head. "Since I've come across you already, I won't allow you to kill anyone today," Chun Ping'an said. "Perhaps you feel like I'm being unreasonable and relying on my power to bully you. But this doesn't matter. Speaking reason is a very complicated and disliked matter in this world. In reality, things are the same both ways. You find the dog eaters unreasonable, and you'll kill the old shopkeeper, his son, as well as the customers of this shop. However, your victims and the children who survive but are unable to attend school anymore will also feel like you're being very unreasonable. Incredibly unreasonable. You should understand these simple principles before deciding to kill other people. The tanned young boy looked up. The young man in azure cotton robes truly didn't want to waste his silver coins by the looks of it, and he immediately picked up his chopsticks and started to eat upon seeing the tanned young boy stop eating. After eating a piece of roast pork, Jian Lai grabbed another piece of braised river carp. Only after eating this did he say, "The reason I'm doing all this and saying all these things to you is because I can detect hesitation and conflict in your mind. You also feel like that detestable old man and chef actually have their good sides as well. You have to realize that I've come across many people before, and there are some humans who are less human than spirits like you who are working hard and trying their best to assume human form. In fact, some of them are even inferior to spirits like you. Far inferior. As such, I'm willing to treat you to this meal and also." Jian Lai smiled and retrieved a piece of loose silver, placing it on the table. He then retrieved a lesser heat coin and also placed it on the table, giving it a flick and having it stop close to the tanned young boy's bowl. "Let me tell you a possibility. You can treat this lesser heat coin as something that I'm lending you, and it's up to you whether you repay me or not in the future. If you decide to repay me, it doesn't matter whether that's in 10 years or 100 years. I know it will be very torturous, but you can suppress the pain in your mind and refrain from killing these people first. If you manage this, you'll then be able to spend this money to save more of your kind in the future. There are a myriad of ways to go about this. For example, you can become an esteemed immortal in the eyes of a county magistrate first, and you can help the county magistrate resolve some minor but mysterious matters. After all, you won't come across unreasonable cultivators like me in small county cities, so you'll be able to deal with all of the troublemaking ghosts and spirits. Taking this opportunity, you can persuade the county magistrate to prohibit the trade of dog meat in his jurisdiction. You can also become an extremely wealthy businessman in a region, and you can offer a very high price to buy all of the dogs in a prefecture or a province, forcing all of the dog meat shops to shut down. Of course, you can also cultivate earnestly and found your own force, establishing your own rules in a region measuring hundreds or even thousands of kilometers in radius. One of these rules can pertain to treating dogs with kindness." "Why are you doing this?" the tanned young boy asked. Jian Lai thought for a moment before smiling and replying, "Even though I'm very disappointed in the world and very disappointed in myself, I suddenly understood something recently. I still need to speak reason regardless of how heavy the price of speaking reason is." "Is Mr. a Confucian disciple?" the tanned young boy asked. Jian Lai hesitated for a moment before shaking his head and replying, "I can't be regarded as a Confucian disciple just yet. However, I am indeed a swordsman." The tanned young boy was slightly astonished. "You can borrow more money from me if this isn't enough. However, we'll need to keep a clear record of your debts in the future." Jian Lai stood up slowly and continued, "Give this some careful thought. I don't hope to see you return the lesser heat coin straight away. Even if you use some smarts and travel to a further prefectural city, I won't interfere as long as you're out of my sight and hearing. However, I'll feel very happy to have treated you to this meal if you decide to embark on a new path. I won't have wasted my money." Jian Lai left the dog meat shop and walked down the small alley by himself. The tanned young boy suddenly ran out and chased up to Jian Lai asking, "Mister, you said that I could borrow more money from you in the future, but you haven't even told me your name or your hometown. How will I find you if I run out of money in the future?" Jian Lai stood still and scratched his head, replying, "I was simply being polite with you. After all, it doesn't cost anything to extend such offers." There was a dazzling smile on the tanned young boy's face. After assuming human form, this was the first time that he had come across such a fated opportunity and smiled so happily. Jian Lai patted the tanned young boy's head and said, "My name is Jian Lai, and I'm traveling around the Stone Brush Nation right now. However, I'll return to Bamboo Scroll Lake Cyan Gorge Island in the future. Remember to cultivate earnestly, okay?" Jian Lai continued to walk forward. "Mr. Chan, the old shopkeeper and his family are actually all good people, so I'll definitely offer them a very high price, so high that they can't reject my offer to buy the shop," the tanned young boy shouted. Afterward, the youngest child in their family can study earnestly in his own private school and scripture library, and they can also hire the best teacher around. After that, I'll also return to the mountains to cultivate in earnest." With his back facing the tanned young boy, The young man in azure cotton robes who was carrying no sword yet claimed to be a swordsman simply raised an arm and gave a thumbs up. In the end, the tanned young boy asked loudly, "Where is your sword, Mr. Chun?" Chun Ping'an simply strode forward and replied, "In my heart." The young swordsman paused briefly before laughing heartily and adding one final remark before he left. It was late at night, and only 3 words reverberated softly around the small alley. "It's extremely quick." The planning and implementation of the kanji stalls and medicine shops were already finished, so Ma Dui and Xingyi initially thought that they would leave the city and continue their journey as normal, traveling to the border region of the Stonebrush Nation. There were 2 Maline entities who had been border soldiers before death, and their final wish pertained to returning to the border region. They could no longer enjoy life at home, but their hearts and souls still yearned to return home. However, Chun Ping'an decided to stay in the prefectural city for an extra day. When evening arrived, he stood near the city gates and watched from a distance as the skinny and tanned young boy left the city. He then went to the small alley to look at the dog meat shop that had already shut down. On the walls beside the door were the 2 door gods from the Yuan clan and Chao clan of the Great Li Empire, with the scholarly god holding a ritual baton and the martial god holding a steel truncheon. Only after observing these 2 things did Chun Ping'an return to the inn. Chun Ping'an had come across Guan, a cultivator accompanying the army of the Great Li Empire, again when standing near the city gates, and the latter had purposely walked away from the other subordinates and soldiers to stand with Chun Ping'an. Guan had asked in a quiet voice, "Are you fishing for a big one? Are you letting the tiger return to its mountain such that you can find the location where it cultivated into human form? And that way you can obtain 1 or 2 fated opportunities in the form of immortal treasures. Or perhaps you're allowing the demon to leave, just treating this as an act of goodwill and the cultivation of good karma." Mountain spirits and water spirits successfully assuming human form indicated some form of huge fated opportunity. Either they accidentally entered an abandoned immortal abode, or they ingested some miraculous medicine that contained abundant spiritual energy of heaven and earth. Regardless of the reason, one could either find the location in the former case or directly refine the demon in the latter case. Both would allow one to obtain surprising riches. Chun Ping'an had smiled and replied, "It's the latter reason." There was disappointment in Guan voice as he said, "What a shame. If you didn't appear, then my 2 colleagues who always complain loudly about being too poor to fill their bellies had already set their eyes on the small demon hiding in the dog meat shop. However, since you already interfered in the situation, I persuaded them to abandon their plans. This was only some additional benefit after all, and we still have our normal military duties to deal with. Of course, we could have indeed worked together if you had chosen the former option. Then haven't I decreased your colleague's income by suddenly interfering in the situation? Will that make things difficult for you?" Chun Ping'an asked. Guan smiled faintly and replied, "Even though my 2 friends and I are all cultivators, we're more importantly members of the Great Li Empire's army. So, your question and your concern are already enough. It's rare to come across someone from home when traveling outside, so there's often no need to be so polite. However, being polite is naturally the best, while not being polite won't matter either. In the latter case, we can simply pretend to be strangers when we meet again, and we'll deal with everything according to the laws of the Great Li Empire." "This is completely correct," Chun Ping'an replied in sincere agreement. Guan laughed heartily and said, "I'm very happy to meet such an impressive person from home in this place that's so far away from home." Chun Ping'an cupped his fists and replied, "It's inconvenient for me to reveal my identity right now, but I'll definitely invite Brother Guan for a drink if the opportunity arises in the future." Guan, the martial secretary from the Great Li Empire, lightly struck his chest plate with his fist and replied, "Then I'll remember your promise. Let me say this first. When I save my brothers on the battlefield, it's okay for them to owe me a life. However, no one can owe me wine and not give it to me, not even the heavens." This was a chance encounter between 2 people from the same nation in a foreign land, and both their initial encounter and their farewell were filled with satisfaction. After Chun Ping'an had walked far away from the city gates, 2 cultivators wearing specially made light armor from the Great Li Empire's arsenal slowly walked over. One was a sturdy young man, and one was a slender and frail-looking young woman. The young woman looked at Guan, who seemingly wanted to continue his conversation with the young man in azure cotton robes, and she asked in curiosity, "Iran, losing so many immortal coins so early in the new year isn't a good omen, so why are you still so happy?" Guaniran chuckled and replied, "Can I not be happy? My happiness is worth more than 1,000 taels of gold." That young cultivator was able to give the small demon one lesser heat coin without any hesitation at all, the sturdy young man said. He asked for nothing in return, and he even went as far as to purposely see the small demon off to the city gates. In addition, he also set up kanji stalls and medicine shops in the city beforehand, and according to our intel, this wasn't a one-off. Rather, he's been doing this everywhere. If it were any other cultivator from the mountains, I don't believe that they would possess such kindness and benevolence. However, after observing this person's words and actions, everything seems to be consistent and reasonable. I feel like Iran didn't do anything wrong. This person is a fellow countryman, so it won't be a bad thing if he becomes a friend worthy of drinking with us. The young woman was surprisingly carrying a giant sword even though she was so slender, and she grumbled, "These men are all the same. You all like to puff yourselves up at your own cost when you come across someone who slightly suits your taste. Is there any need?" "Miss Chi, I'll become unhappy if you speak about us men," Guaniran replied with a serious expression. "I'm far richer than you Shanfang, so do I need to puff myself up at all?" Back then, who was it that said that even the farts of profligate descendants from wealthy clans like me reek of copper? What can you expect from a hog but a grunt? The young woman, who was as slender as a spring willow, exclaimed in anger. She furiously punched Guaniran in the shoulder, causing him to stumble back several steps. She then turned around and returned to the city wall. Guaniran grimaced as he rubbed his shoulder, a bitter smile on his face. This punch truly hurt. Meanwhile, the sturdy young man called Yu Shanfang looked on in amusement. The young woman was a militarian cultivator from the Wind Snow Temple. Most militarian cultivators from True Martial Mountain were mid to high-ranking martial officials in the army of the Great Li Empire, and the young woman with the surname Qi had the opportunity to become one too. However, she had chosen a different path, and the border army of the Great Li Empire wasn't surprised by her decision. Such choices were common among militarian cultivators from the Wind Snow Temple, with many of them preferring to become lone wanderers when they left the mountains. Some female cultivators also chose this path, and they would often become the personal subordinates of some important generals. Yu Shanfang placed an arm around Guaniran's shoulders and said in a low voice, "Iran, I've known you for at least 7 or 8 years already, and after all these years, I still feel like you're the child of a general from the capital, one from a middling clan. Otherwise, you wouldn't have been tossed to this shitty place by your clan, and for almost 3 entire years at that. Not only that, but you've always been the lowest ranked type of accompanying cultivator as well. You have to understand that your capital accent has pissed off a lot of people already. On the other hand, Chi has only known you for 2 years, yet she's already seen through your status and background during this expedition south, insisting that you're the descendant of a wealthy clan. Why is this? We're brothers who have shat in the snow and had our bums frozen off together. Yet even we find it hard to believe that you're the descendant of a wealthy clan. Perhaps the two of you have already." Yu Shanfang allowed Guaniran to break free, after which he pushed his thumbs together and made faces at Guaniran. There was exasperation on Guaniran's face as he replied, "Who doesn't know that Chi has already admired Sword Immortal Wei Jin, her junior uncle from another branch in the Wind Snow Temple, for a very long time?" He then sighed and continued, "Moreover, I already have a fiancée, and to tell you the truth, she is indeed from a wealthy clan in the capital. However, I've never seen her before. This might sound funny, but only when I lift up her red veil during our wedding will I finally know what my wife looks like. Which deeply unfortunate young woman has ended up matched with you? A crude cultivator from the border army?" Yu Shanfang asked in curiosity. "Who mocks their own brother?" Guaniran huffed as he placed a palm on the hilt of his saber, one that was standard among all of the soldiers in the army. He walked along the streets of this foreign nation with Yu Shanfang, looking around at the houses that were almost all decorated with the 2 door gods of the Great Li Empire. There were few pillar clans in the Great Li Empire, so the Yuan clan and the Chao clan were without a doubt large clans among large clans in the nation. In reality, however, there were 2 other pillar clans that could rival the Yuan clan and the Chao clan. It was just that one was in the mountains and seldom became involved in mortal matters. This was the Yu clan. The other was present in the imperial court, and it never became involved in matters pertaining to the border army. Their ancestors had migrated from Yi province to the capital more than 200 years ago, and the direct descendants of the clan would return to their ancestral hometown to pay respects to their ancestors every single year. This was an event that even the Ministry of Rights of the Great Li Empire regarded with great importance. In fact, even the imperial preceptor had once smiled and said to the emperor that during that period of time 100 years ago when eunuchs had interfered in political affairs, external relatives had seized power, regional rulers had rebelled, and cultivators had wantonly robbed the nation, leading to the most chaotic and tragic times in the history of the Great Li Empire. It was thanks to the immense effort of this clan in studiously patching things up for the nation that the Great Li Empire had avoided shattering into 1,000,000 pieces. Yu Shanfeng interlocked his fingers and stretched them outward, causing his joints to pop loudly. Different people had different fated opportunities, and Yu Shanfeng, who could be regarded as half a vagrant cultivator, had climbed up the ranks one step at a time, all the way from a low-rank scout to a marshal secretary. Truth be told, there are times when the brothers and I feel like you're a bit different from us when we drink and chat together, Yu Shanfeng said casually. However, we can't explain what about you is different. There's nothing we can do about this, and we can't compare to the descendants of the generals who have been squeezed into the army. After all, we all have terrible eyesight and observation skills thanks to washing our eyes with sandstorms on the border every day. We can't compare to those descendants of officials and nobles at all. Guaniran smiled and revealed. I only make 3 types of friends. Those who dare to risk their lives on the battlefield, scholars who are genuinely upright in the imperial court, and cultivators from the mountains who are genuinely good people. There was a look of slight melancholy on Guaniran's face as he continued. However, it's a shame that the first and third type of people don't seem to live very long. Death on the battlefield goes without saying, and after experiencing life and death all these years, farewelling our brothers who are our best friends, we'll no longer sob like little girls anymore when death comes knocking again. As for the third type of people, I was once acquainted with a young man called Yu'in, someone the same age as me whom I admired greatly. How good was this person? He was so good that I felt like, regardless of how terrible the world was, it would be enough as long as he was standing in front speaking reason and working to make a change. One would feel happy as long as one looked at his figure walking further and further forward. However, such a good cultivator like him died such an unworthy death. For the sake of the bigger picture, his clan, who had extremely high hopes in him, and the imperial court of the Great Li Empire both chose to reduce the major problem to a minor one, and the minor one to nothing at all. I feel is wrong, but will those paramount beings listen to the words of a measly person like me? No, they won't, even if my surname is Guan. Yu Shanfeng chuckled and retorted. So what if your surname is Guan? Is that very impressive? It's not like you're from Cloudstay Prefecture's Pillar Guan clan. Your profile in the military documents clearly states that you're from the capital. Are you not aware of our general's personality? He already did everything in his ability to figure out your background, and he told us that you're from a third-rate general's clan in the capital. To say nothing of being neighbors with a pillar clan or a head minister's clan in Ichi Alley, your clan doesn't even have the right to buy a small courtyard in Cheer Street where many generals live. What, perhaps you have some blood relationship with Cloudstay Prefecture's Guan clan? Our general's former comrade and biggest opponent, General Liu, once mysteriously discovered that a young and seemingly unremarkable scout in his ranks was actually a descendant of a second-rate general's clan in the capital. One of his ancestors was a second-rank great general, and this ancestor had even been bestowed with an esteemed and coveted title. Our general feels like he's been one-upped by General Liu, so he always dreams about there being the descendant of a first-rate general's clan among his subordinates. It's absolutely hilarious. Guaniran hesitated for a moment before saying, if I die one day, perhaps our general will cry and laugh as he scolds me. Say what? You're genuinely a descendant of Cloudstay Prefecture's Guan clan? Yu Shanfeng asked in astonishment. Guaniran nodded and replied, I'm the great-grandson of the main branch. Even though my great-grandfather isn't a cultivator, I can't help that his physique is extremely strong. He's more than 100 years old, yet he can still drink half a liter of wine and eat an entire kilogram of meat every meal. Even the imperial preceptor was surprised when he witnessed this back then. Yu Shanfeng rolled his eyes and said, "Like I would believe you. If you've met Imperial Preceptor Cui before, then I've even met the Emperor before." Guaniran chuckled and replied, "I've said what I wanted to say, so it's up to you whether you believe me or not. In any case, that's got nothing to do with me." "Are you really from that Guan clan?" Yu Shanfeng asked with a hint of suspicion. Guaniran smiled and nodded, saying, "I'm telling you the truth. Remember how I took leave and returned to the capital during New Year 3 years ago? Chi-Chi said that she once traveled around the capital with her Dao mentor during the first month of the new year. Perhaps I was going from door to door to wish people a happy new year in Rainflower Street or Cheer Street back then. So Chi-Chi was able to unintentionally catch a glimpse of me. However, there are very strict rules in those 2 areas of the capital, so Chi-Chi wouldn't have dared to follow me. Of course, Chi-Chi wasn't acquainted with me back then, so she wouldn't have needed to investigate my background anyway." Yu Shanfeng silently raised an arm, acting furtively as he tried to stroke Guaniran's head. Guaniran cocked his head and dodged Yu Shanfeng's hand, asking, "What are you trying to do? Have you gone crazy thinking about women? Are you hallucinating and thinking that I'm Chi-Chi?" Yu Shanfeng rubbed his hands together and replied, "I've yet to touch a mighty figure in my life, so I want to touch you to tick this off my list. TSK, the Pillar Guan clan. I'm definitely going to get you drunk tonight and touch you to my heart's content. I'll even call our brothers over to touch you one at a time. If you dare to do something so debauched, then I'll go and marry your younger sister whom you always describe to be like a celestial maiden. I'll then call you brother-in-law every single day," Guaniran said with a cheeky grin. Yu Shanfeng immediately kicked Guaniran in the backside. Guaniran didn't dodge his kick. The 2 of them continued to walk forward together. Yu Shanfeng suddenly sighed and said, "You should reveal this to our brothers when they leave the world for good, even if it's in secret." Guaniran fell silent for a moment before shaking his head and replying, "I can't bring myself to say it." "Understandable," Yu Shanfeng said with a melancholy nod. Guaniran suddenly smiled and said, "If I die on the battlefield one day and the truth is revealed, then both you and our general can at least pat your chests and brag about this to the other armies of the Great Li Empire. Don't go dying on us," Yu Shanfeng said with a shake of his head. Guaniran also shook his head, saying slowly, "I can't die simply because I was born into the esteemed Guan clan from Yi province. There's no such rule in the Great Li Empire." Yu Shanfeng smiled and replied, "You're mistaken. I feel like however you regarded Yuan back then is how I regard you now. Even if you become a high-ranking official in the imperial court of the Great Li Empire in the future, and even if you become comfortable in the capital and no longer don armor, while I'm still fighting with the army and perhaps as far away from you as can be, I'll still feel relieved." "I'll feel relatively relieved." Guaniran nodded in response. "There's something I don't understand. Why do descendants of generals, whether from a big clan or a small clan, all like to conceal their identities and become unremarkable reconnaissance soldiers in the army?" Yu Shanfeng asked in curiosity. Guaniran smiled and replied, "Every descendant of a general in Ichi Alley and Cheer Street who wants some face will hope to become a genuine reconnaissance soldier at some point in their life. They won't rely on the fame and achievements of their ancestors, and they'll rely on their own ability and hard work. They'll hack off the heads of their enemies and hang them on their saddles. When they return to Ichi Alley and Cheer Street in the future, having served their time as scouts in the army, they can beat up the bastard descendants of those head ministers from Ichi Alley if they ever get into conflicts with them. Of course, this is as long as they aren't too unreasonable. Afterward, they won't need to worry about causing trouble for their elders or clan. They definitely won't face any trouble. This has always been the case, starting from my grandpa's generation all the way to my generation." Yu Shanfeng clicked his tongue in wonder and remarked, "Seriously?" Guaniran stomped his foot and said with a faint smile, "And that's why the Iron Hooves or the Great Li Empire's heavy cavalry are able to march across these lands. Say, Iran, is it possible that you might become the first descendant of Cloudstay Prefecture's Guan clan to obtain an esteemed posthumous title for martial generals in the future?" Yu Shanfeng asked in a quiet voice. "Thank you for your blessings. Thank you for your blessings." Guaniran hurriedly bowed in mock gratitude, saying in jest after he stood up straight, "But why can't it be a posthumous title for a military governor? Yu Shanfeng patted Guaniran's shoulder and lectured. You should keep a low profile and speak more modestly since you're already a descendant of the Guan clan. Otherwise, just your capital accent is already enough to piss off other people, so how will you cope in the future? Won't you be treated like a woman and touched by me and the brothers every day in the future? Guaniran stroked his chin and said, Indeed, that's a very good point. I suppose you're right. On the peak of Tassel Mountain, there was exasperation on the mountain god's face as he said, Tell me, how will you deal with all the troubles in the future if you continue to delay? Just how long have you left that extremely busy mountain master hanging? You're draining his goodwill toward you regardless of how much he admired your crooked teachings in the past. The old scholar sat cross-legged and massaged his ears with his hands, replying, Humans can't bend the will of nature. Let him be. According to the news we have, there's something fishy going on at Mount Longhu's ancestral hall. After that person unleashed a sword strike, spiritual master Fire Dragon from the complete Reed continent seemingly made matters worse by providing his help. The mountain god in golden armor said slowly. The old scholar smiled and said, This might look like a terrible thing in the eyes of others, but how do you know this result isn't exactly what the external great heavenly master from Mount Longhu wants to see? The mountain god of Tassel Mountain was only mentioning the matter in passing, and to say nothing of an external great heavenly master, he wouldn't even care about the actions of a legitimate great heavenly master from Mount Longhu's heavenly master residence. However, the mountain masters of the three Confucian schools had encountered obstacles when trying to visit Bai Zhe, the proud scholar, and the old scholar. Either they failed to achieve their goals, or they failed to even gain an audience. Even the mountain god of Tassel Mountain felt anxious about this matter. This was because these matters were far too important. They pertained to the most fundamental great trend of the world. I have very few disciples compared to the other major scholarly branches, the old scholar said. However, this can't be helped. I'm very picky when it comes to these things, and no one can compare to me in this regard. Is there any fun in spewing this nonsense to me? The mountain god scoffed. The old scholar nodded and replied, It's at least more interesting than saying it to myself. The mountain god shut up and remained silent. The old scholar was slightly disappointed upon seeing the mountain god refuse to argue with him, so he could only continue. My first disciple, Cui Chan, was the most talented in a literary sense, and he was also the most prone to getting hung up on things. This should have been the best attitude for studying and obtaining new knowledge. However, Cui Chan was too smart, and his view of the world was a pessimistic one. This was the case from the very beginning. Let me skip to my third disciple, Qi Jingchun, first. He was the most knowledgeable, and it wasn't just that his knowledge was the loftiest. As his master, even I had to praise his knowledge as magnificent and all-encompassing. If he hadn't ended up with me as his master and had instead joined the scholarly lineages of the etiquette sage or the second sage, perhaps he might have achieved even greater things. Qi Jingchun's view of the world was an optimistic one. Returning to my second disciple, Zui Yu, he was the most stubborn of my disciples. However, he was actually a very good person. When we were still living in poverty in some small alley, I tasked Zui Yu with looking after our finances. He did much better than me, someone who can't hold on to money no matter what. After all, could I not spend money if Cui Chan asks for go guides, Qi Jingchun asks for books, and Aoyang asks for wine? I was as poor as could be, but I could only puff myself up at my own cost and pretend to be rich. However, I felt at ease letting Zui Yu look after the finances. Zui Yu wasn't the most talented, knowledgeable, or good-natured of my disciples, but he was the most balanced one. He was innately patient and focused as well, so his ability to pick up swordsmanship was unfathomably quick even though he started learning very late. Yes, unfathomably quick, so quick that even I felt slightly flustered at the time. I was afraid that he might become the first 14th-tier sword cultivator in several thousand years in the majestic world. What would I do then? Zui Yu might appear distant from the human world, but it's actually he who's most afraid of loneliness. Even though he's been wandering around the seas far away from the human world for the past 100-odd years, where is his mind truly at? He's still thinking about his master and his junior brothers. Which master wouldn't be fond of a disciple? Do you remember that reputable scholar scolding me in a slightly vicious manner back then? But how could I argue back? He was only a measly sage of a Confucian academy, and he didn't even have the right to be honored in the Confucian temples. As such, I would have been stooping to a very low level to argue with a junior like him. That being the case, Zuoyu secretly went over to give him a good beating. But seriously, he stupidly admitted to his crime, and he even ran back to apologize to me. Why apologize? Apologize my ass. Couldn't he have worn a mask before beating that sage up? Afterward, couldn't he have run away and refused to admit guilt? What could the others do? Perhaps they would run over to hit me? But could they beat Zuoyu? Even if they could, would they be able to beat Zuoyu to death if he refused to admit guilt no matter what? If they dared to beat Zuoyu to death, then would I not dare to beat them to death? Sigh, and that's why I always say Zuoyu is too impulsive and lacks consideration for the consequences. What could his pitiful master do? After all, little Qi and the others were all standing there and watching. As such, I could only punish him and giddily run over with him to apologize to that sage. Afterward, I even had to do this and do that to compensate everyone. It was truly annoying. Zuoyu is willing to admit his wrongdoing to you, but how could he be willing to apologize to others? The mountain god asked in puzzlement. The old scholar rolled his eyes and replied, I explained the situation to Zuoyu in private, of course. He was so light-handed when he beat up that sage, so how could he live up to his status as a disciple of the scholarly sage? How could he vent the frustration for his master? Zuoyu silently nodded in understanding when he heard this, and he said that it made sense and he would take more care in the future. I'm truly speechless, the mountain god said with a chuckle. The old scholar sighed in resignation and continued, things are more complicated with my fourth disciple, and he can only be regarded as half a disciple. It's not that I don't recognize him as my disciple, but rather that he feels like his background is too lowly, so he isn't willing to cause any extra trouble for me. In other words, he's the one who doesn't recognize me as his master. Even though the reasoning is different, this situation is very similar to the situation regarding my final disciple. Apart from them, my unofficial disciples each have their own strengths and weaknesses as well. Among them, Mao Xiaodong is the most similar to me when it comes to teaching and answering questions for others. Of course, his knowledge is still yet to reach the level of his master. He follows the rules no matter what he does, so he's still a fair way off the old geezer's notion of doing as one pleases without overstepping the boundaries. However, it's a shame that outsiders can't explicitly and carelessly point this out. One has to understand and overcome this by oneself. In this sense, the Buddhist notion of self-cultivating monks is very appropriate. On the other hand, the Taoist sect is quite lacking in this regard. The old scholar didn't delve into more detail, nor did he elevate the topic to a higher level. Instead, he changed the topic and said, when I argue with other people, I never feel like I'm definitely correct or definitely perfect. I need to understand the good and the bad of the other party as well. Otherwise, what's the point of arguing with them? I might feel extremely satisfied after making all of my arguments, but where has my belly full of knowledge actually landed? The most frightening thing about knowledge is to have it become sourceless water that falls from the sky. It might appear impressive as it pours down from lofty heights, but what significance does it hold apart from being pointlessly praised by our own scholars? It won't touch the ground and provide nutrition, and it won't provide any tangible benefits to the common people. Rather than giving the people big baskets and small baskets for them to place the principles in and thus feel at ease from the myriad of troubles of life, we're instead stuffing the baskets full of essays that only remain on paper. As such, people mistakenly think that only scholars and sages are worthy of speaking reason. This is an incredibly exhausting mindset, so how can we hope to educate and enlighten people if this is the case? The old scholar stood up, his back slightly hunched as he gazed into the distance and murmured, is it wrong to say that people are innately good at birth? No, it's not. However, a very awkward problem soon arises. Since people are innately good, then why is the world so complicated? What have the teachings of Confucianism actually taught people? Has it taught people to become evil? What can we do about this? The old geezer and the etiquette sage were both waiting, and they finally waited until my arrival. I posited that people are innately bad at birth, using this argument to promote healthy debates and the perfection of knowledge in the Confucian sect. Most importantly, I was able to make a strong case for this viewpoint, and the strength of my principles allowed me to become the scholarly sage. However, an even more awkward problem arose. To an outsider of the Confucian sect like you, perhaps you might feel like the philosophy of people being innately bad at birth can become a scholarly branch of the sect. This doesn't matter. However, can it truly become the main branch of the Confucian sect? The old scholar answered his own question saying, "No, it most definitely cannot." He then raised a thumb and pointed at himself, continuing, "In fact, even I feel the same way." There was a long period of silence. The mountain god heaved a rare sigh. A sigh that carried a hint of sympathy. The old scholar didn't retract his thumb, and he suddenly sighed with emotion and said, "Thinking about this, I truly am both a sage and a hero. Yes, I am indeed very impressive." The mountain god remained silent the entire time. The old scholar finally turned around and asked in exasperation, "Why aren't you retorting me? How am I going to use reason to subdue you if you remain silent?" "I won't give you the chance at all," the mountain god replied calmly. "Oh, then by the looks of it, I've already used my morality and virtue to subdue you," the old scholar replied in satisfaction. The mountain god took a deep breath. What else could he do? The old scholar's expression suddenly became serious as he said, "There's no rush to shoo me away just yet. I also want a copy by Zay and that most disappointed scholar. Let me wait for a while longer. Even though I don't know what they're planning, I still want to wait and see the outcome. What if you find out that you're wrong in the end? Will you not feel disappointed?" the mountain god asked. The old scholar clasped his hands behind his back and narrowed his eyes, replying with a cold chuckle, "Feel disappointed? Disregarding the choices we've made regarding our great Tao, no one from me to my in-house disciples feel disappointed. Not in the least." Atop the golden arch bridge, there was a sword stabbed into the bridge railing, and the tip of the sword as well as a small portion of the blade had already sunk inside the railing, leading to a brilliant explosion of sparks. The woman sitting beside the sword placed a parasol leaf umbrella horizontally across her knees. She then stood up and opened the seemingly unremarkable umbrella, raising her head and glancing up before disappearing in a flash. Only the parasol leaf umbrella remained hovering on the spot. She arrived inside a blessed land in a single step, right beside a well. The parasol leaf umbrella that had been casually given away naturally possessed much deeper implications. After the previous owner gave it away, however, the new owner might not live for long enough to discover the truth. However, did this have anything to do with the previous owner? This was a scheme, yet it wasn't necessarily a scheme. The Tao that can be explained isn't the universal Tao. A tall and sturdy old Taoist priest appeared beside her almost instantly, saying with a faint smile, "Long time no see." She ignored him, surveying the surroundings before nodding and saying, "Taking into account the current situation, this can already be regarded as a fairly big investment." "Of course. Otherwise, how else can I discuss Tao with the Tao ancestor?" the old Taoist priest replied with a chuckle. She shot a glance at him. The old Taoist priest remained calm and composed. She focused her gaze on someplace in the lotus flower-blessed land, seemingly coming to a realization as she sneered. "It seems like you still remember your roots." The old Taoist priest chortled with hearty laughter, replying, "I'm simply going along with the great trend and spending little effort. Things will be turned upside down, and one continent shall sink." Phew. The woman frowned upon hearing this. The old Taoist priest sighed and remarked, "The current times are ultimately different from the old times." The woman shook her head and said, "I've simply swapped owners." The old Taoist priest didn't say anything in response. It wasn't suitable for others to comment on this matter, not even him. "Your land is only this small?" the woman asked. "It genuinely can't be any bigger," the old Taoist priest replied with a smile. The woman seemingly lost interest, with her figure disappearing slowly as she left in disappointment. She returned to her own world and put away the parasol leaf umbrella. The old Taoist priest stood beside the well and looked down, gazing intently at the dark well water. After retracting his gaze, he looked up at the sky and said, "This is my greeting gift when I return to the heavenly world. How is it?" In the lotus flower world that was connected to the lotus flower blessed land, there was an old man who was still observing a drop of water, watching it slide down the uneven lotus leaves. The drop of water was the same size as ordinary raindrops, yet many of the lotus leaves were as large as towering mountains. There were even larger ones that were the same size as mortal states. As such, the veins running through a lotus leaf might measure tens or even hundreds of kilometers in length. If one wanted to observe the journey of a water droplet and witness its final endpoint, one would most definitely have to wait for an exorbitantly long time for the conclusion to arrive. However, the old man was in no hurry at all. Time slowly flowed past. As the greatest regulation in heaven and earth, even the mighty river of time had to voluntarily take a detour when it flowed past the old man. Trees flourished and flowers bloomed following the arrival of spring, yet it was now almost impossible to see a single royal descendant going on a spring outing in the northern region of the Stonebrush Nation. The three steeds continued to travel north, stopping and starting numerous times as they did so. Before they knew it, summer had already arrived. They decided to rest on a small path winding through a mountain ridge near a border pass of the Stonebrush Nation today. And Zhengyi was busy preparing a meal while Ma Dui was putting on makeup in front of a mirror. She was humming a song, and she appeared to be in a fairly good mood. The small and green copper mirror in her hand was a spirit tool that she had obtained for a low price, and it was a relatively rare sun and moon radiance arc design mirror. Ma Dui had spent less than 2 taels of silver to purchase this mirror after haggling with a stall owner, who had very poor appraisal skills. According to the elderly ghost cultivator who was responsible for appraising treasures for Zhengyi and Ma Dui, this mirror could sell for at least 40 to 50 snowflake coins at immortal ferry stations. Qian Ping'an sat beside them and flipped through his so-called ledger book, inside of which the large majority of names already had a faint vermilion mark under them. This mark signified the successful completion of their final wishes. However, the final wishes of some other ghosts and entities could only be set aside for the moment. In reality, however, both Qian Ping'an and the deceased individuals were well aware that these final wishes would very likely become long-cherished but unfulfilled wishes. To borrow the concepts of Buddhism, these wishes would be extremely difficult to fulfill regardless of whether one was alive or dead. This was a knot in the hearts of the entities, and some of these knots became tangled knots that couldn't be undone. Overcome with grief and fury, some entities couldn't control their emotions and eventually experienced an explosive rise in rage and hostility, almost transforming into malicious ghosts on the spot. In the end, they could only rely on the heart purification talismans plastered around the hall of the underworld to maintain their final slivers of reason. The thrifty Ma Dui didn't complain about Mr. Qian drawing up heart purification talismans again and again, immediately replacing those that had lost their spiritual energy. This was a continuous drain on their immortal coins, and it wouldn't be an exaggeration to call this activity a bottomless abyss for money. They came across many defeated and scattered soldiers of the Stonebrush Nation as they traveled north, and many of these soldiers would come together to form groups of wandering bandits in the mountains and forests, gathering and dispersing on a whim. These wandering bandits furiously attacked and pillaged the army provisions of the Greatly Empire, and for the sake of living on and carrying out the lofty sense of justice in their hearts, some of the bandits were forced to turn their blades toward the common people of the Stonebrush Nation. 3 bouts of heavy snow had descended at the end of last year, and coupled with the chaos of war, few people remained in the northern region of the Stonebrush Nation. There were only 300 to 400 wandering bandits and steeds at most, yet there was only a pitiful amount of food to go around the region. Moreover, the families in the smattering of impoverished cities on the border of the nation were hoping to rely on this food to survive until the next harvest time. As such, they couldn't afford to feed the defeated soldiers of the Stonebrush Nation, and thus it was inevitable that conflict arose between the two parties, with one side trying not to starve to death and one side trying to stay alive to fight against the existential crisis gripping the nation. As time went on, the rift and conflict between the two parties continued to grow and worsen. Qian Ping'an and his companions had come across one such conflict that almost resulted in bloodshed. As the two sides argued, a young soldier dressed in tattered armor almost swung his saber at a skinny old man's shoulder. However, Qian Ping'an suddenly dashed over and grabbed the standard anti-cavalry sword of the young soldier, causing the dozens of defeated soldiers to immediately charge over. Qian Ping'an stomped his foot in response, and the soldiers and horses of the Stonebrush Nation were sent stumbling and rearing. Qian Ping'an then tossed away the anti-cavalry sword in his hand, having it return to the scabbard of the young soldier. The powerful impact of the landing sword caused the young soldier to stumble back several steps. Qian Ping'an didn't say anything afterward, simply standing on a street of the small town with his horse. The starving soldiers of the Stonebrush Nation had no option but to silently retreat from the county city. Qian Ping'an and his two companions slowly took their leave as well. Behind them, the residents of the small town started to loudly abuse the soldiers of their nation, launching into a tirade of vulgarity. They accused the soldiers of being too weak to fight against the barbarians of the Great Li Empire, yet becoming increasingly capable of harassing the common people of their own nation. It would have been better for these soldiers to have died on the battlefield, as that would have at least prevented them from turning around and harassing their own people. In fact, some people even suggested that they provide intelligence to the heavy cavalry of the Great Li Empire stationed in a large county city nearby, potentially earning them some bounty money. The young soldier suddenly started bawling after the cavalryman left the county city. An old military officer who looked like a lieutenant stopped his horse and also shed tears. All of the soldiers were emaciated and pale, with almost all of them carrying wounds as well. They also stopped their horses, looking around in anxiety and confusion. They were at a complete loss. Qian Ping'an told Ma Dui and Zhang Yi to stay put, after which he slowly rode over by himself. This was a renowned and time-honored cavalry unit from the border region of the Stonebrush Nation, and it had once boasted more than 2,000 elite soldiers at its peak. Now, however, there were fewer than 80 survivors, with all of them filled with deep apprehension as they looked at the approaching Qian Ping'an. Qian Ping'an tossed them a large and heavy pouch, saying in his increasingly fluent official dialect of the Stonebrush Nation, "It's time for you to disperse. Take off your armor and take off the armor of your horses. Use this money to return home and settle down." The old military officer caught the pouch and opened it up to take a look, only to see a pouch full of official gold ingots. A confused look spread across his face as he looked up at Qian Ping'an. "If you're unwilling to give up, then you can pick a few quick-witted brothers to disguise as merchants and travel to a county city that's already regained peace and stability to purchase some rations," Qian Ping'an said. "You'll need to do your best to avoid the spies and scouts of the Great Li Empire, and you should buy fewer rations each time to avoid raising the suspicion of the local officials. I'm sure that even you guys can't tell who's a friend and who's a foe right now. Is that all? Or do you want something else?" the old military officer asked. Qian Ping'an nodded and replied, "You don't have a choice right now. Since things are already as bad as they can be for you, why don't you take a risk and give this a try? Moreover, if I wanted to rely on your dozens of heads to ask for rewards from the prefectural officials who have already defected to the Great Li Empire, I wouldn't have needed to go to so much trouble. Perhaps your subordinates can't tell, but you should be very clear about this as a fourth-tier martial artist." The old military officer wanted to say something, but he couldn't help but hesitate. Qian Ping'an shook his hand and continued, "I can't help you any more than this. I'm not a charity or anything, so don't try to treat me as such." The old military officer could only huff and abandon his thoughts that were indeed a little bit shameless. After accepting the pouch of gold ingots that could save their lives, he cupped his fists in gratitude at the young man in azure cotton robes and said, "Thank you for being so just and righteous." Qian Ping'an cupped his fists in response before turning around and leaving. As for what the scattered soldiers of the Stonebrush Nation decided to do in the end, Qian Ping'an didn't stay behind to observe them from the beginning to the end like he had the young shop attendant from the dog meat shop. The old military officer felt slightly deflated. He hadn't even asked the young man for his name yet. When Ma Dui saw Mr. Qian returning on his horse, she teased, "You claim that you aren't a charity, but in reality?" Qian Ping'an smiled and replied, "Even if you see through me, you don't have to expose me. Keeping quiet is a top-notch interpersonal skill to have." Ma Dui was just about to retort him in an incisive manner, yet Qian Ping'an had already trotted off on his horse. She and Zhang Yi had no option but to hurriedly catch up. Following the resolution of the conflict, the hooves of the three horses lightly galloped across the land that was filled with lush greenery and blooming flowers. Returning to the present, Ma Dui put down her copper mirror and turned around to look at Qian Ping'an, who had already closed his ledger book, asking, "Mr. Qian, will we return to Bamboo Scroll Lake before autumn arrives?" "We should be able to," Qian Ping'an replied with a nod. Ma Dui stretched lazily and accidentally hit the large bamboo case behind her, and she hurriedly reached back to stabilize it. The bamboo case was brimming with treasures that they had purchased for low prices from the 3 cities that they had recently visited. Even though the treasures were all wrapped in silk and protected by cotton, Ma Duyi was still worried that she would accidentally damage those especially delicate children. According to the old ghost who resided in the colored glazed pagoda, most of these treasures were precious curios that nobles in the mortal world liked to collect. However, these treasures were far less valuable than gold and silver in chaotic times like these. When peace eventually returned, though, even the small bird feeder that they owned would be worth 200 to 300 taels of silver. If they came across a wealthy individual who was truly fond of the treasure, then even raising the price twofold wouldn't be a difficult task. In reality, these treasures could also be placed inside Mr. Chen's minimization treasure. However, Ma Duyi liked to open the bamboo case to rifle through the treasures whenever they stopped to take a break. For example, she always liked to take out the small copper mirror to look at and play with. Since she wanted to do this, however, she had to suffer the consequences and carry the bamboo case herself. Zhengyi was already a legitimate fourth-tier cultivator now, and with Ma Duyi's superior talent and comprehension, she had already advanced to become a fifth-tierine entity. In terms of actual cultivation potential, however, Zhengyi still had the edge over Ma Duyi. This was the importance of one's physique. One wasn't afraid to cultivate slowly, while the other wasn't afraid to cultivate quickly. As time went on, Zhengyi and Ma Duyi were building a stronger rapport and managing to cooperate better and better. When they ate, Qian Ping'an still chewed slowly as was his habit. On the other hand, Zhengyi was squatting beside him and wolfing down his food. The sturdy young boy asked casually, "How is my walking meditation fist stance, Mr. Qian?" Qian Ping'an smiled faintly and replied, "It's so." Zhengyi sighed in grief upon hearing this. Even though he knew that his performance of the six-step walking meditation wasn't necessarily smooth and perfect, he thought that it would at least be practiced and improving. Ma Duyi poured fuel on the fire, commenting, "You're not cut out to practice martial arts, and even a martial arts novice like me can see this clearly. Your fist stance is loose and empty, and you haven't even set foot on the correct path yet. Zhengyi, were you mistakenly thinking that you were quite skilled already?" Qian Ping'an consoled Zhengyi and said, "Martial arts isn't your main focus, and having it strengthen your physique and temper your body is already enough. In fact, developing a breath of true qi, and having it conflict with the spiritual energy in your acupoints is actually undesirable. Either I failed to learn things properly, or I learned things very slowly. Why aren't you worried, Mr. Qian?" Zhengyi asked gloomily. Qian Ping'an was very amused to hear this, and he replied, "I would definitely be worried if worrying could help solve the problem." Ma Duyi couldn't contain herself any longer, and she was just about to say something. However, Qian Ping'an had already raised his hand and said, "Shut up, you're not allowed to pick on Zhengyi's cultivation for your own amusement. Also, I would be shocked if you could determine how good or bad Zhengyi's fist stance is. Are you just borrowing the casual assessment of some senior?" A wide smile appeared on Ma Duyi's face, causing her beautiful eyes to squint slightly. She remained silent and tacitly accepted Qian Ping'an's accusation. The three of them continued to travel along the border of the Stonebrush Nation. They arrived at an immortal force in the north called Descending Falcon Mountain, where the green mountains were undulating, the scenery was beautiful, and spiritual energy was relatively abundant. Ma Duyi and Zhengyi both felt extremely relaxed and satisfied after entering the territory of the immortal force, and they couldn't help but take a few extra breaths. This was the reason why ordinary people in areas of scant spiritual energy might never come across a cultivator in their entire life. Merchants sought profits from bustling cities, and in the same vein, cultivators would subconsciously avoid regions with little spiritual energy when they traveled around the world. After all, there were far too many requirements when it came to cultivation, and it was necessary to take things slowly and steadily, especially for cultivators at the lower 5 tiers and immortals at the middle 5 tiers. Wasting their precious time in areas with no spiritual energy for thousands of kilometers would be absolute stupidity. The relentless battles near the border regions before had affected the immortal forces of the Stonebrush Nation, and for some unknown reason, many small immortal forces gathered in this area and vaguely appeared to treat Descending Falcon Mountain as their leader. Descending Falcon Mountain owned a large territory, and it had previously maintained a single lineage system as well, meaning that there were few people in the large and powerful sect. As such, Descending Falcon Mountain loaned many of its mountains to the small immortal forces of the Stonebrush Nation that had come here to take refuge. Thanks to this phenomenon, Descending Falcon Mountain gained much renown in 2 short years. It was said that many immortal shops had opened here as a result, and this was the main reason for Qian Ping'an deciding to visit. Since they were passing by, Zheng Yi and Ma Dui could try to see whether the dozen or so spirit tools that they had bought for bargain prices could sell for a good price. Moreover, all of the immortal coins they earned would belong to them. As for how they split up the profits, Qian Ping'an didn't care at all. He would leave it up to Zheng Yi and Ma Dui to discuss by themselves. However, he figured that Zheng Yi would definitely get the shorter end of the stick. With how skilled and shrewd Ma Dui was with her plans and calculations, even 3 Zhang Yes combined wouldn't be able to rival her. Qian Ping'an thought to himself that if he even opened a shop to do business in the future, Ma Dui would indeed be a very good helper. When they arrived at a mountain on the outer regions of descending Falcon Mountains territory, Qian Ping'an discovered that there were many mortal refugees gathered here as well. There was a bustling marketplace that appeared no different from those in the cities, and as they made their way through the area, they saw many construction sites that were bustling with workers. Apart from strong young men, there were also women and children who had survived the trip to descending Falcon Mountain providing their help as well. What surprised Qian Ping'an the most was the fact that a martial sage temple of the Stonebrush Nation had already been completed. Even though it was crude, it possessed everything required by the imperial etiquette of the nation. Apart from all this, some cultivators were still busy setting up a mountain protection formation. This was probably the earliest foundation for an immortal fairy station, or an immortal force in the mountains. 2 cultivators saw Qian Ping'an and his companions walking over with their horses, and there was a slightly guarded look in their eyes as they observed the 3 unfamiliar faces. They secretly communicated with the others, intending to have numerous cultivators gather over from all directions to deter these outsiders. Qian Ping'an was no longer wearing the guest Elder Jade tablet of Cyan Gorge Island, so he could do nothing but sigh in helplessness regarding this situation. He asked one of the cultivators for directions, saying that he wanted to visit the mountain where the ancestral hall of descending Falcon Mountain was located. After the cultivators belonging to the same force as a cave-abode cultivator pointed out the directions for Qian Ping'an and his 2 companions, they watched the 3 people leave the market before finally breathing a sigh of relief. They then continued to work on the mountain protection formation. There was nothing they could do about this. They were from a third-rate immortal force, so even if they had moved here to seek refuge with descending Falcon Mountain, they could only scrape together a pitiful amount of immortal coins compared to the extremely wealthy first-rate forces. As a result, they were tossed to this area by the ancestral hall of descending Falcon Mountain, and they were essentially forced to act as the door gods for the eastern entrance of descending Falcon Mountain. If any trouble arose, for example, if the heavy cavalry of the Great Li Empire saw descending Falcon Mountain as an eyesore and decided to charge over, then they would naturally be the first to suffer the consequences. They would have no option but to grit their teeth and act as a shield for descending Falcon Mountain. It was necessary for all immortal sects in the mountains to experience hardships, humiliation, and grave dangers as they were established, rose to prominence, and passed down their teachings. The elderly abode tier cultivator who was already the so-called old ancestor of his force stood on an elevated platform and secretly observed a little refugee child who was helping his parents wipe off their sweat. The old cultivator smiled knowingly. This child possessed great potential, yet the ancestral hall of descending Falcon Mountain was slow to realize this, and it was only now that they planned to offer 1 lesser heat coin and a mountain of more than 5 kilometers in radius to change the passports of this family. However, the old cultivator staved off the overwhelming objections to turn down the goodwill of descending Falcon Mountain. He planned to personally take this child in as a direct disciple, and after 60 years or 100 years, perhaps his immortal force would gain a new abode tier cultivator? Or perhaps the child might even advance to the sea observation tier like the clan rejuvenation ancestor from back then. This wasn't a wild dream, and just thinking about this made the old cultivator feel extremely happy and satisfied. Even though the junior brothers and senior brothers had argued intensely in the ancestral hall before, 1 lesser heat coin and an additional mountain would be of extraordinary significance to their immortal force, they stood strong and united after they decided to turn down the suggestion of descending Falcon Mountain's ancestral hall. Even the most miserly junior brother among them decided that he would gift a spirit tool that he had cherished for a long time to the little child when they eventually joined their immortal force and became a disciple of their old ancestor. After leaving the market, Chan Ping'an suddenly glanced back into the distance and asked, "Did the two of you notice anything?" Zheng Yi and Ma Dui were completely baffled by Chan Ping'an's question. Chan Ping'an shook his head and said, "It's nothing. Maybe I saw wrong." "Mr. Chan, it's not good to leave people hanging," Ma Dui said in amusement. Chan Ping'an smiled and replied, "When you guys become powerful enough to stand alone and take charge in the future, you'll understand that saying things halfway is a profound skill that's worth investigating." Ma Dui clicked her tongue in wonder and remarked, "Mr. Chen's ability to praise himself in a roundabout manner is becoming increasingly smooth and practiced." Chan Ping'an turned around and cupped his fists, saying, "Thank you for your praise." Ma Dui chuckled in annoyance and exclaimed, "Mr. Chan, you'll no longer be the Mr. Chan that I respect and look up to if you continue to behave." Zheng Yi bobbed his head around and chirped, "No, you're just exaggerating." It was clear that the young boy sided more with Mr. Chan. However, Zheng Yi was immediately punished for his words, with Ma Dui stretching her arms and causing her sleeve to whip across his face and leave stinging pain. "A noble person settles conflicts with words, not violence," Zheng Yi complained in annoyance. It was Ma Dui's turn to bob her head around this time, and she replied, "Only villains and women are hard to deal with. A sage said this. Don't you understand a principle as simple as this?" Chan Ping'an smiled wryly and interjected, "This saying isn't interpreted, but if you're willing to deride yourself as such, then I have no complaints either." The three of them jested and laughed as they arrived at the proper entrance of descending Falcon Mountain. Compared to the two immortal forces that they passed when traveling here, it was clear that things were much stricter and there was more than met the eye. Even the concentration of spiritual energy here was slightly superior to that of Yellow Barrier Mountain. There was a small and peaceful town beside a river at the bottom of the mountain, and it was perhaps more accurate to call it a relatively large village. Looking at the number of houses and other structures, there were probably around 1,000 people living in this village. Without the presence of the mortal world, the so-called might of immortal forces in the mountains would be nothing more than buildings without foundation and water without a source. However, many immortals who were yet to reach the peak of the mountains couldn't be bothered or found it beneath themselves to ponder on this principle. In order to reach the village at the foot of the mountain and climb the mountain afterward, one needed to first cross a river, not on an arch bridge, but instead on a flat and narrow bridge that looked like a thin snake lying on top of the river. There was a villager walking over with a buffalo in tow, and the sturdily built man most likely heading to the nearby fields to do manual work. Behind the man was a little child riding on a lush green length of bamboo and shouting "Giddy up," as if they were riding a horse. Chan Ping'an stopped with his horse, letting the villager and his buffalo with curved horns to pass first. The villager had clearly seen and experienced many things before, so he didn't really pay any extra attention to the three outsiders. On the other hand, the little child riding the bamboo horse was extremely curious after seeing a real horse. Chan Ping'an smiled at the little child, and the child smiled shyly in response. The child then chased after their father and the buffalo. Zheng Yi found this quite interesting. Flashes of brilliant sword light frequently sliced through the sky atop descending Falcon Mountain, which was surrounded by swirling clouds and mists. However, the little child riding the bamboo horse was already accustomed to this, so he was instead more interested in the horses behind them. He turned around again and again to look at the three horses. Chan Ping'an led his horse onto the narrow stone bridge that only sat a small distance above the river. When he reached halfway, the villagers walking over from the other side of the river also needed to stop and patiently wait for him to cross first. Chan Ping'an nodded in thanks after he finished crossing the stone bridge, and the villagers waiting to cross also smiled and nodded in response. Zheng Yi watched on in thought. Ma Dui also fell into contemplation. It was at this moment that Chan Ping'an suddenly turned around and looked up at the sky. The small sword resting ground in his sleeve and the guest elder jade tablet of Cyan Gorge Island became hot at almost exactly the same time. Lu Jimao hadn't kept things a secret back then, and he had revealed to Chan Ping'an that he could track down his location based on these two items. Chan Ping'an had expressed no issues regarding this. A streak of snow-white light rapidly shot through the sky, entering the territory of descending Falcon Mountain before landing with a loud boom. This was an old cultivator from Cyan Gorge Island, and his expression was flustered and his spiritual energy was chaotic. He was none other than Zhang Yi, the cultivator responsible for looking after the secret chamber and the fishing room. Zhang Yi had exhausted almost all of the spiritual energy in his bonded acupoints to make this secret trip to the north, and doing so was an extremely rash act that would damage the foundation of his great Tao. This was similar to how delivering urgent military updates via relay horses would lead to injuries and eventually death for many horses. A beaming smile initially spread across Zheng Ye's face, especially since Zhang Yi was his benefactor who had personally dragged him out from the large fire pit that was Thatch Moon Island. However, he immediately shut his mouth after seeing Zhang Ye's anxious expression and miserable state. Chen Ping'an immediately provided support to the swaying Zhang Yi before asking in a soft voice, "Something happened at Bamboo Scroll Lake? Things have been turned upside down." Zhang Yi exclaimed with a heartbroken expression. Chen Ping'an sighed upon hearing this. In reality, he had already predicted such an outcome. However, this wasn't the worst-case scenario, so he hadn't made too many plans to address the situation. Truth be told, there was not too much he could do about this situation anyway. At the end of the day, human power had its limit. The current situation was very easy to understand. Either General Su Gaoshan of the Great Li Empire had made his move, or the person supporting Palace Willow Island's Lu Laoqing was starting to enter the fray. Of course, it was also possible that the two parties had decided to directly join forces. It was possible that Millet Grain Island's Tan Yuanyi had defected and abandoned their alliance for the sake of self-preservation. On the other hand, Lu Jimao might have been unwilling to give up his foundation in Cyan Gorge Island, and he might have also fallen victim to the schemes of others. As such, it would be completely understandable for him to be in grave danger. No matter what, this was definitely bad news for Chen Ping'an. Chen Ping'an had initially analyzed and understood the future trend of Bamboo Scroll Lake already, yet the Go board that he had worked so hard to create had perhaps been casually swept onto the floor by another Go player already. Zhang Yi thudded to his knees and begged, "I beseech you, Mr. Chen, please save the island master." Chen Ping'an shook his head and directly asked, "Has Senior Zhang already hidden or detained Gu Kan and his mother?" The kneeling Zhang Yi looked up and replied, "Everything happened very suddenly, so Cyan Gorge Island had no time to do any such thing. Even if we had time, I wouldn't have done something because I understand that it would have definitely backfired and come back to bite us. Only Mr. Chen can save the island master." Chen Ping'an helped Zhang Yi up and said slowly, "Please stand up to speak, Senior Zhang. I'll listen to your explanation first, but let me say that it's almost impossible to rescue Lu Jimao right now. I'm sure that Senior Zhang already understood this fact when traveling over here. Indeed, you simply came here to do everything in your ability. However, the rest will be up to the will of the heavens." Zhang Yi nodded lightly, a bitter smile on his face. However, there was still a hint of gratitude in his eyes. Meanwhile, Chen Ping'an was feeling a massive headache. In front of Zhang Yi, there were some things that he could only avoid saying. Just like how he had joked around with Ma Dui just then, there were some things that one couldn't expose even if one saw through them. Zhang Yi was naturally doing everything in his ability, but it was extremely likely that he was also aware that his tracks had already been noted down by some people with ulterior motives. Perhaps these people were peering down at them from someplace in descending Falcon Mountain. Taking this into account, Chen Ping'an was already showing great benevolence by not beating him while he was down and killing him with a single punch. "Let's walk and talk," Chen Ping'an suggested. Zhang Yi composed himself, and the first thing that he said caused a violent ripple to surge through the minds of Ma Duyi and Zhang Yi, who were listening with pricked ears. The island master was no match for a cultivator of unknown identity, and he was severely wounded and detained in a water prison located in Palace Willow Island. Not only that, but General Su Gaoshan of the Great Li Empire personally came to Cloud Pagoda City and tossed a whip into the lake, proclaiming that he would execute all of the vagrant cultivators of Bamboo Scroll Lake, who refused to yield within 10 days. Chen Ping'an's first thought was that the powerful cultivator who had managed to forcefully suppress Lu Jimao was either Mahist Wanderer Su Ru or Sage Ruan Qiong. Zhang Yi, who had traveled over from far away, and Chen Ping'an, who was leading his horse, walked together along the bubbling river that was like an emerald green silk ribbon. Perhaps the scenery in this beautiful area was truly peaceful and serene, or perhaps he felt slightly reassured by the presence of the bookkeeper who could be regarded as part of their island. No matter the reason, Zhang Yi had experienced countless significant events in his lifetime and gradually started to calm down. slowly recounting to Chan Ping the sudden change that had swept through Bamboo Scroll Lake. As it turned out, everyone had underestimated Su Gaoshan's appetite. He was one of the great generals of the Great Li Empire's heavy cavalry, and his eyes had been trained on the luminous Vermilion Empire the entire time. After conquering the capital of the Stonebrush Nation with almost no effort, he surprisingly turned around with his army to invade another vassal state of the luminous Vermilion Empire. Even though the war was bloody and tragic, Su Gaoshan still had the time to personally visit Bamboo Scroll Lake in a seemingly leisurely and carefree manner. Su Gaoshan showed himself in public without trying to conceal anything, announcing to everyone that he was going to crush Bamboo Scroll Lake. Those who obeyed him would live, while those who disobeyed him would die. It was as simple as that. The concept of obeying him or disobeying him was even simpler. The vagrant cultivators who were willing to hand over all of their belongings could live and leave Bamboo Scroll Lake with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Those who were willing to hand over half of their belongings and join the army of the Great Li Empire as the lowest-ranked accompanying cultivators to attack the luminous Vermilion Empire could also live and temporarily stay at Bamboo Scroll Lake. However, the ownership of the islands and mountains and whether or not they would have to relocate their forces and ancestral halls in the future was completely up to the discretion of the Great Li Empire. Meanwhile, a new group of secretive cultivators from outside of Bamboo Scroll Lake had arrived at Palace Willow Island at the end of spring this year, becoming esteemed guests of the island. Following Su Gaoshan's public appearance and loud proclamation to the tens of thousands of vagrant cultivators in Bamboo Scroll Lake, Lu Laoqing had personally led a group of cultivators to launch a surprise assault on Cyan Gorge Island last night. Among the group of cultivators, one old cultivator had displayed paramount mystical abilities after Lu Laoqing shattered the protection formation of Cyan Gorge Island. He was undoubtedly at the upper 5 tiers, and his full power attack was shockingly able to annihilate the entire Hengbo residence in a single go. Afterward, the other cultivators lying in wait had unleashed a dozen or so immortal treasures to create a formation, capturing Lu Jimao, who had been attempting to flee following his defeat in battle. As Lu Jimao was being marched to Palace Willow Island, Zhang Yi didn't rush over to seek death upon realizing the dire nature of the situation. Instead, he had secretly fled through a tunnel hidden under the lake, rushing to the Stonebrush Nation as quickly as he could and using the guest Elder Jade Tablet to find Chan Ping. Chan Ping didn't say anything, allowing Zhang Yi to finish his explanation before he asked, "What is Lu Laoqing's attitude toward all of this?" Zhang Yi shook his head and replied, "I only learned afterward that Lu Laoqing never spoke a single word to anyone from the moment that the group of cultivators who were almost all Earth Immortals arrived at Palace Willow Island to the moment that our island master was caught and brought to Palace Willow Island. He didn't meet with any cultivator from Bamboo Scroll Lake either." Zhang Yi sighed with emotion and continued, "Even though I resent Lu Laoqing immensely, I have to concede that he possesses the power and might expect it of an upper 5-tier vagrant cultivator. I suppose that many vagrant cultivators in Bamboo Scroll Lake are viciously cursing Lu Laoqing in their minds right now, accusing him of being a traitor and a lapdog of the Great Li Empire," Chan Ping said. Zhang Yi smiled bitterly and replied, "The tens of thousands of vagrant cultivators in the 1,000 or so islands have all been scared witless already, so just the mention of Lu Laoqing or Su Gaoshan is probably enough to make them shiver in fright right now." He then shook his head lightly and continued, "The little backbone and courage that remained in Bamboo Scroll Lake has been shattered once and for all. There was that perilous but perfect cooperation in the past, where the forces of Bamboo Scroll Lake all joined together to hunt and kill that nascent tier cultivator and golden core tier sword cultivator from the outside. However, we'll no longer be able to drink and discuss this matter with pride in the future. Lu Laoqing, old bandit Lu. I genuinely can't imagine what kind of immense benefit he's receiving to betray and sell out the entire Bamboo Scroll Lake. Back then, I was the one who received the command and spent almost 10 long and difficult years searching for Hong Su, the woman guarding the entrance of the Vermilion Cord residence. I finally found the reincarnation of the previous ruler of Bamboo Scroll Lake, and brought her back to Cyan Gorge Island. And it's because of this that I know that Lu Laoqing's feelings toward Bamboo Scroll Lake aren't as cold and apathetic as rumored in the outside world." Zhang Ye's expression was pitiful as he stopped and squatted beside the river, appearing slightly adrift as he washed his face with river water. The current situation seemingly made Zhang Yi feel even more anxious and helpless than the time his and Lu Jimao's island had been destroyed and sunk to the bottom of Bamboo Scroll Lake when they were still young and fighting their way to the top. As one grew older, it was inevitable that one's fighting spirit and ambition would start to wane. This was especially the case since Zhang Yi only had 60 years left to live. Even if he wanted to sacrifice himself to take down his enemy, would his enemy entertain his fanciful wishes? Just a flick of their fingers, and Zhang Yi, who was a relatively powerful Dragon Gate tier cultivator in Bamboo Scroll Lake, would disintegrate into ashes on the spot. Walking forward with his horse and carrying a sword and saber on one waist, Qian Ping'an said calmly, "Being the kind of person that he is, Lu Laoqing definitely cares about more than just the title of ruler of Bamboo Scroll Lake now that he's decided to return. When he visited Cyan Gorge Island and suppressed Gu Ken as well as that flood dragon, he was simply putting up some smoke and mirrors. This was something that he didn't necessarily need to do. In reality, all of the vagrant cultivators in Bamboo Scroll Lake could only wait for death and the judgment of these external forces regardless of whether Lu Laoqing did that or not. After all, Lu Laoqing was one of very few people who foresaw the unstoppable trend of the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent sweeping over to Bamboo Scroll Lake. On the other hand, many vagrant cultivators mistakenly believed that Bamboo Scroll Lake could stand isolated from the unstoppable trend, feeling like things would be best if the outside world became increasingly chaotic. That way they could seize the opportunity to make a profit just like they're doing in the war-torn Stonebrush Nation right now. I'm sure that many of them have eaten their fill thanks to this calamity. However, they never imagined that they would become the next target right after making a huge profit. After working hard and saving for tens upon hundreds of years, who have they actually been working for? Zhang Yi was still squatting beside the river, and he could only say in helplessness, "We can't completely blame Bamboo Scroll Lake for lacking foresight and vision." To put things bluntly, with the exception of Cyan Gorge Island and the opposing Azure Mound Island and Heavenly Governess Island, the remaining islands need to rely on the mood of the Great Li Empire's heavy cavalry to see whether they're willing to extend a coattail for them to ride on. They won't necessarily be able to join the forces of the Great Li Empire regardless of how much they offer. Qian Ping'an nodded and concurred. That's indeed the case. Zhang Yi stood up and exhaled, continuing, "If the vagrant cultivators were truly smart and courageous enough to make big gambles, then they would have come to the Stonebrush Nation and made contact with the heavy cavalry of the Great Li Empire earlier, voluntarily pledging their loyalty. They would then simply need to become familiar with some generals in the army, allowing their names to be recorded in the official documents by the spies of the Great Li Empire's Green Ripple Pavilion. That way they would be making a huge profit right now, and they would also obtain many benefits when Bamboo Scroll Lake is divided up again in the future. That would be a true case of maximizing profits and obtaining as much as they could. In any case, Cyan Gorge Island did very well already, and our defeat can be attributed to the fact that we failed to make contact with Su Gaoshan the entire time, with our attention stagnating at Millet Grain Island's Tan Yuani. In addition to that, there was also the sudden interference from Lu Laoqing. We were aiming for lofty heights, yet all of these factors came together and made us fall short." Qian Ping'an frowned and fell deep into thought, falling silent for a moment before asking in puzzlement, "Senior Zhang, do you know of any large sect-level immortal forces in the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent that are intending to relocate their sect in the next 10 years? Even if it's only a vague sign or something that appears like a rumor, have you heard anything at all?" Zhang Yi shook his head in dejection, replying, "No, I haven't heard anything of the sort. For example, sect leader Qi of the Divine Edict sect, the strongest sect in the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent, just became a heavenly lord and is enjoying great stability. The Divine Edict sect is also a Taoist sect full of Taoist immortals cultivating in tranquility, and they've never displayed any sign of wanting to expand outward." Listening to someone else's casual conversations with the island master before, it seems like the Divine Edict sect even recruited a group of official Taoist priests. This is very abnormal, and the island master went as far as to speculate whether the Divine Edict sect has uncovered a new blessed land that they need to send people into. Apart from them, none of True Martial Mountain, the Wind Snow Temple, the Cloud Forest Zhang clan, and Old Dragon City are showing any signs of wanting to expand or relocate. "I understand," Qian Ping'an said with a nod. Zhang Ye's heartstrings were extremely stretched and tense in the beginning, yet after they suddenly relaxed, His expression immediately reflected his extreme exhaustion and anxiety. However, Zhang Yi smiled when he saw the young bookkeeper beside him. Even Mr. Chen wasn't complaining about having a hard time yet, so wouldn't he have wasted hundreds of years of his life if he wallowed in misery like a little girl now? Zhang Yi recounted to Chen Ping'an his final conversation with Lu Jimao in Hengbo residence. He wasn't putting in a good word for Lu Jimao, and he was simply recounting things as they were. The older generation of Bamboo Scroll Lake passed away one after another, while the younger generation of Bamboo Scroll Lake were each more domineering than the other. Having started off as an official immortal, Zhang Yi could no longer find someone to chat with. As he approached the end of his life, however, he unexpectedly came across another cultivator just like him, someone who endured hardships for seemingly no benefit. He couldn't stop talking once he started, but he still made sure to pay attention to the skinny young man's expression. Seeing that he wasn't becoming annoyed or impatient, Zhang Yi finally felt at ease. Chen Ping'an listened patiently the entire time. When Zhang Yi finally ran out of things to say, Chen Ping'an warned in a quiet voice, "Senior Zhang, it's best that you don't return to Bamboo Scroll Lake. Nothing can be done to rectify the situation, so you're better off staying far away to silently observe the progression of events." Zhang Yi shook his head, sighing with emotion and asking, "Where can I go? Cyan Gorge Island is my home. If these sudden changes hadn't taken place, I wouldn't have minded finding a place beside Bamboo Scroll Lake similar to the summer resorts of wealthy nobles to live out the rest of my life in peace." Chen Ping'an hesitated briefly before replying, "Senior Zhang, can I ask you something slightly off topic? In the eyes of experienced Dragon Gate tier cultivators like you, are you able to vaguely sense with your heart the aura of a place when you pass by? Or has Lu Jimao ever mentioned something before?" Chen Ping'an shook his head and replied, "The island master has never mentioned something before, and I've never had the ability to detect any such aura either. Regarding the observation of fortunes and auras in an area, this is the core ability of deities of the mountains and waters. I surmise that even Earth immortals aren't able to observe these things clearly. As for powerful cultivators like Island Master Lu Jimao, who are only a single step away from advancing to the upper 5 tiers, it's difficult for me to say whether they possess such abilities or not. After all, even immortal observation techniques will only allow one to observe physical matters. These techniques are unable to communicate ethereal and intangible matters like aura and fortune." Chen Ping'an was extremely hesitant, wanting to say something but deciding against it in the end. Zhang Yi suddenly laughed loudly and remarked, "What's wrong, Mr. Chen? This is the difficulty that comes with being a good person. You're clearly working for the benefit of other people, yet you're weighing things up even more carefully than when you're working for the benefit of yourself? Mr. Chen, there's a saying that I couldn't tell you because we weren't that familiar with each other before. Now, however, we're not necessarily friends yet, but it's hard to say whether I'll be alive or dead tomorrow. So, excuse me for speaking these principles to you." Chen Ping'an smiled and said, "Please go ahead, Senior Zhang." Zhang Yi looked at the young man in front of him, remaining silent for a long time before chuckling and saying, "I suddenly have nothing to say anymore. What should I do now?" Chen Ping'an felt slightly helpless, and he could only grab his sword nurturing gourd to drink some wine and lift his spirits. Just listening to Zhang Yi recount the sudden changes that had swept through Cyan Gorge Island had already been incredibly exhausting. This sudden change would force changes in all other areas, so Chen Ping'an would definitely become even busier and more exhausted when making plans in the future. There's a small immortal force that only just moved into the easternmost side of descending Falcon Mountain, and I detected a strange aura in that area when I was passing by, Chen Ping'an said. If Senior Zhang is willing to trust me, then why don't you settle down in that area first? Just treat it as a way to calm down and relax your mind. The worst-case scenario right now is Lu Jimao being killed in Palace Willow Island to serve as a warning to everyone else in Bamboo Scroll Lake. At that time, no one will be able to stop Senior Zhang from doing what he wants. I definitely won't try to stop you either. No matter what, this is better than returning to Cyan Gorge Island right now. Your return might be viewed as some sort of formless provocation, and it's entirely possible that you'll be captured and thrown into the water dungeon in Palace Willow Island as well. Perhaps Senior Zhang isn't afraid of this, and you might even feel happy to see Lu Jimao again. However, only Hengbo residence has been targeted right now, and Cyan Gorge Island is yet to completely collapse. including Whitefish Island. None of the other vassal islands have been affected either. This means that Cyan Gorge Island needs someone to stand up and lead if there's a positive turn in the future. I'm not a suitable candidate, and I'm not willing to take this role either. However, Senior Zhang is the person whom Lu Jimao trusts most in Cyan Gorge Island, so you'll be able to convince and lead the island even if your cultivation base isn't very high. Zhang Yi thought about this carefully before nodding and saying in self-ridicule, I'm destined to have a toilsome life. Zhang Yi suddenly used his mind's voice to tell Chen Ping'an, be careful of Palace Willow Island trying to use me as bait. If this is true, then why are they taking this extra step? Why don't they directly use Gukan and the Spring Courtyard Mansion as bait? I can't make sense of this, but I'm sure that there are many considerations to justify such a decision. Of course, Mr. Chen has most likely realized this already, so I'm simply pushing my luck and trying to put myself at ease. From the moment that I left Cyan Gorge Island, the weight was already lifted off my shoulders and placed by me onto Mr. Chen's shoulders instead. Chen Ping'an smiled knowingly and replied, even so, there are some words that still need to be said. At the very least, saying these words will make both sides feel much better. This is a small principle that I just learned from a young man with the surname Guan. Mr. Chen needs to learn principles from other people? Zhang Yi teased. Chen Ping'an pointed at Zhang Yi, following which he pointed at Ma Duyanxingyi. He then casually drew a circle around the village located at the foot of Descending Falcon Mountain and said, there are countless principles that exist beyond the books, and to use a small example from just then, even the villagers over there understood the etiquette of giving way and allowing others to finish crossing the bridge first. However, how many lofty cultivators from the mountains are willing to adhere to these minor principles? The gloominess in Zhang Ye's mind cleared slightly as he replied, then I'll listen to Mr. Chen's suggestion and head to that small mountain first. I'll also wander around and look for some principles. How does that sound? Chen Ping'an smiled faintly and replied, that sounds like a good plan. Zhang Yi looked around at his surroundings. How many years had it been since he had last calmed down to observe the scenery of the mortal world beyond the mountains? I won't immediately rush back to Bamboo Scroll Lake for the sake of Lu Jimao. I still have my own things to do first, and even if I go to Bamboo Scroll Lake, I'll only do what's within my ability, Chen Ping'an said. Zhang Yi nodded and replied, I would have definitely been riddled with extreme worry if I had heard this answer from you right after we met. Now, however, I don't have the heart or the fighting spirit anymore. Nor do I dare to force others to cater to my whim. Mr. Chen, please deal with this situation as you see fit. There are some polite words that still need to be said. Chen Ping'an and Zhang Yi said in unison. The two of them exchanged a smile. Zhang Yi straightened his collar and took his leave, not soaring away on the wind but instead walking across the small bridge over the river, slowly and steadily. Chen Ping'an, Ma Dui and Xingyi walked along the small bluestone paths of the village with their horses, and after climbing up the mountain gate of Descending Falcon Mountain didn't turn them away. In fact, the mountain gate was just a small archway building that didn't even have a guarding cultivator. Descending Falcon Mountain maintained a single lineage system, and even if there was more than one lineage in the ancestral hall of the sect, it was still only a very small number. Disregarding the guest elders, there were probably fewer than 20 actual cultivators in Descending Falcon Mountain. However, atop Descending Falcon Mountain was a place similar to the Parasol Leaf Continent Sky Calling Street and Pond Water City's Ape Crying Street. After all, it was an ironclad principle that immortals needed to use silver to forge a path when they cultivated. As such, Descending Falcon Mountain didn't appear too deserted even though there were so few cultivators. Chen Ping'an turned around and looked back. Zhang Yi was already nowhere to be seen. Was Zhang Yi not disappointed? He hadn't received the answer he wanted to hear from Chen Ping'an, and Lu Jimao was now in grave danger as a prisoner of Palace Willow Island. In fact, it was extremely likely that his path of the Great Tao would be severed just. With all this in mind, Zhang Yi was naturally as disappointed as could be. Being disappointed was one matter, and being able to push aside the disappointment to carry out one's responsibility was another matter altogether. This was a test of one's character and willpower. Because of this, Chen Ping'an felt respect for people like Zhang Yi, Guan Yiran, the ghost general he had encountered by chance in the Taoist Enforcer Temple, Yellow Barrier Mountain Su Xinjai, and so on. When one walked along a muddy path full of hardships, One would never know whether one would come across stronger winds and snowstorms, or whether one would come across one or two good people who were like flickering lights in the world. Jian Ping summoned the ghost entity who was a sea observation tier cultivator when alive so that he could provide some knowledge and support for Ma Dui and Zhang Yi, lest they make bad decisions on the street atop descending Falcon Mountain. When they arrived on that street, Ma Dui visited all of the shops regardless of their size, comparing the prices of the treasures between each shop. She sold some spirit tools and also purchased some treasures, and she had already decided how to divide the spoils with Zhang Yi a long time ago. In addition, she also helped to come up with plans for Zhang Yi, suggesting to him which treasures would be the best to buy. He shouldn't simply look for the treasures of the highest quality. Even though Zhang Yi became bleary-eyed from looking at the various treasures, often feeling a strong urge to buy certain ones, he still listened to Ma Dui's suggestions and followed her guidance. The human and the ghost had already become genuine friends. Jian Ping saw all of this, and he smiled happily in his mind. Because these were immortal stores, some mortal curios that had gathered dust for tens upon hundreds of years, or were just newly purchased, would often be thrown in as an extra gift for the transactions made with immortal coins. This was similar to how the shopkeeper in Ape Crying Street had given Jian Ping 3 items for free following his purchase of the painting and the great replica Chu Huang. The old ghost entity was called on whenever Ma Dui or Zhang Yi wanted to make a transaction. Even though many of these shops were opened by cultivators who had severed their relationship with the mortal world, it was not necessarily the case that they could accurately appraise the quality and value of mortal antiques and curios. As such, Jian Ping and his companions were able to snatch many bargains again. They left the street with a bountiful yield. They then left descending Falcon Mountain. Jian Ping followed his planned path and continued along the border of the Stone Brush Nation, passing city after city and pass after pass. As he continued his journey, the ghosts and entities residing in his treasures were also able to complete the final wishes, whether big or small. Of course, Jian Ping paid close attention to the situation of Bamboo Scroll Lake the entire time. However, old government newspapers sold for low prices by shops opened by cultivators like those in descending Falcon Mountain contained little useful news about Bamboo Scroll Lake. Most of them only contained some trivial pieces of rumor. Minor fullness. The 8th solar term arrived in April. If Jian Ping were still in his hometown in the Jewel Small World, then he would see those working in the fields paying full attention as they fought for water. Otherwise, their yield for the year would be detrimentally affected if they didn't obtain enough water. When Jian Ping was just about to return to Bamboo Scroll Lake, he obtained an immortal report that was being spread widely through the northern region of the Stone Brush Nation. There were several pieces of stunning news in the report. Great General Cao Ping, who was leading the other army of heavy cavalry, had employed a very daring strategy, splitting his army into 3 groups and only leaving the central group to guard their base and face off against the border army of the luminous Vermilion Empire. Meanwhile, the 2 other groups of heavy cavalry had defeated 2 vassal states of the luminous Vermilion Empire in quick succession. They naturally didn't conquer these vassal states, but they instead broke up the armies of these nations, forcing them to split up and continually retreat and consolidate in the various larger cities and towns. This, in effect, gave more freedom to the heavy cavalry commanded by Great General Cao Ping. Refugees from the 2 vassal states furiously surged into the border regions of the luminous Vermilion Empire. At the same time, envoys from these vassal states continued to travel to the capital of the luminous Vermilion Empire, crying in grief and kowtowing until their foreheads bled. They appeared extremely pitiful as they begged the army of the luminous Vermilion Empire to save their people from the flames of war, begging them to march forward resolutely and fight a decisive battle against the barbarians of the Great Li Empire. Due to their lack of movement, the army of the luminous Vermilion Empire that was facing off against Great General Cao Ping was subject to a tirade of criticism, being accused by many of shirking battle. News of this rapidly spread through the luminous Vermilion Empire, and there was a popular speculation that the general of this army had secretly defected to the Great Li Empire already. The imperial court of the luminous Vermilion Empire was forced to split into 2 camps, with one camp supporting an offensive strategy and the other camp supporting a defensive strategy. There were mixed opinions among the scholarly officials and martial officials, and the same chaotic mix of opinions was also present in the mountains and outside the mountains. Intense arguments often took place in the imperial court, And there were several times when the Emperor of the Luminous Vermilion Empire was so infuriated that he violently flicked his sleeve and ordered an end to the arguments, telling the officials to retreat and saying that they would discuss the matter again in the future. Perhaps one would say that this was only a significant matter in the mortal world. In that case, a huge and shocking event had taken place in the mountains in early summer. Wei Jin from the Wind Snow Temple's divine platform had found Heavenly Lord Xiesher from the northern complete reed continent, the powerful cultivator who was currently cultivating in seclusion in the central region of the eastern treasured Vial continent. Following a battle between the two, Wei Jin had left the eastern treasured Vial continent by himself and flown on his sword to Stalactite Mountain. Few people had spectated that paramount battle between two immensely powerful cultivators, and the outcome of the battle wasn't made public either. However, since Xiesher was able to remain in the eastern treasured Vial continent, it went without saying that the Taoist Heavenly Lord who had enraged the entire populace of the continent most definitely hadn't lost to Wei Jin. However, even though Wei Jin had failed to defeat Xiesher with a single sword strike, the cultivators of the eastern treasured Vial continent didn't harbor any resentment toward the sword immortal who had just advanced to the upper 5 tiers. Rather, they felt a sense of pride for being from the same continent as him. This was especially so for the sword cultivators of the eastern treasured Vial continent. This was a huge event in the mountains that grabbed the attention of the entire continent. At a similar time, another eye-catching event had taken place in the mountains in the central region of the eastern treasured Vial continent. A cultivator named Ma Kuxuan from True Martial Mountain was yet to reach 20 and had only cultivated for a few short years, yet he had participated in 2 consecutive life and death battles and astoundingly managed to kill 2 golden core tier cultivators. Moreover, it was said that Ma Kuxuan had achieved this feat while keeping hidden his true trump cards. The Luminous Vermilion Empire had chosen to remain silent regarding this matter as Ma Kuxuan's battles had been witnessed by both his Dao Guardian from True Martial Mountain and a royal family member of the Luminous Vermilion Empire. Ma Kuxuan hadn't used any underhanded tactics, and he had achieved victory in the 2 battles fair and square. Ma Kuxuan's stunning feats allowed his name to spread throughout the entire eastern treasured Vial continent. Following minor fullness, the 8th solar term, the continent entered plum rain, the early stages of summer. This was a wet period of time with strong sinister energy, so both mortal humans and cultivators needed to take care to nurture their yang energy and aura of righteousness. They needed to resist the wetness and sinister energy. When traveling north, Chan Ping'an and his 2 companions had taken the route to the east of the Stonebrush Nation's capital. When traveling south, however, they decided to take an alternative route. There was pouring rain on this day, and Chan Ping'an and his 2 companions decided to seek shelter and rest in a rundown pavilion. Chan Ping'an's heart jolted as he felt the wooden case in his sleeve shudder and heat up slightly. The messenger flying sword that most definitely shouldn't have appeared here had surprisingly arrived here. Lu Jimao had already been detained in the water dungeon, so it would be impossible for him to control his small sword resting ground and send out a messenger flying sword under the noses of Lu Laocheng and that group of strange cultivators. In fact, Chan Ping'an intended to ignore the messenger flying sword altogether. After weighing up the pros and cons, however, Chan Ping'an carefully caught the messenger flying sword that indeed belonged to Lu Jimao and undid its restrictions. There were only 3 sentences in the secret letter. You need to be careful when you return to Bamboo Scroll Lake this time. This warning has nothing to do with you, Chan Ping'an, nor does it have anything to do with the agreement between us. I simply can't stand some of these people, and I've borrowed Lu Jimao's flying sword in order to express my sincerity. Keep the flying sword, and there's no need to reply to this letter. Chan Ping'an put away his wooden case and fell deep into thought. This was undoubtedly the doing of Palace Willow Island's Lu Laocheng, but what was the reason behind this gesture? This was worthy of ruminating on. The honest warning from Lu Laocheng definitely didn't relate to the huge changes that had swept through Bamboo Scroll Lake. After all, Chan Ping'an was neither blind nor deaf, so there was absolutely no need for Lu Laocheng to inform him of these matters. Zhang Yi had also rushed over to inform Chan Ping'an of the situation, so with Lu Laocheng's meticulous nature and wild ambitions, he definitely wouldn't waste his time and effort on repeating the same news to Chan Ping'an. That being the case, Lu Laocheng's warning for Chan Ping'an to be careful definitely pertained to something more specific and detailed, something that was closely related to Chan Ping'an himself. Qian Pingan stood on the edge of the small and leaking pavilion and gazed at the curtain of gloomy rain outside. There was an even worse outcome waiting for him right now. Zhang Yi had fled from Bamboo Scroll Lake using the secret tunnels under Cyan Gorge Island. But this was perhaps within the expectations and plans of those people scheming in the shadows. However, why hadn't these people directly targeted Gu Kan and the Spring Courtyard Mansion? Why hadn't they chosen this option, which was easier and more immediately effective? Why hadn't they forced him to rush back to Bamboo Scroll Lake to then directly kill him? Qian Pingan sighed and murmured, "Does this pertain to battles for the Great Tao again? In that case, it makes sense that the culprit wasn't an immortal sect from the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent. Perhaps it was Du Mao's Parasol Leaf sect? Or, no, it definitely wasn't Peace and Tranquility Mountain. Maybe it was the Planchette Writing sect, the first large sect that I passed after arriving at the Parasol Leaf Continent? But I only passed by with Lu Tai back then, and there shouldn't have been any conflicts or grudges between us. Battles for the Great Tao are also divided into high-level and low-level battles, and they're similarly divided into broad and narrow battles. To continue their relentless pursuit all the way to the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent, this person is definitely an upper 5-tier cultivator. In that case, the culprit is unlikely to be the Planchette Writing sect." Qian Pingan furrowed his brows and continued, "But to say that it's the old temple master with paramount Tao power? This doesn't seem plausible either. His path of the Great Tao shouldn't be so narrow." Qian Pingan suddenly turned around and said, "Zhengyimadi, the two of you don't need to accompany me back to Bamboo Scroll Lake. You can directly travel to the border of the Stonebrush Nation and the Plum Glaze Nation and wait for me at Staying Pass." Zhang Yi wanted to say something, but Ma Dui immediately tugged his sleeve and stopped him from speaking. Qian Pingan turned around and continued to gaze at the curtain of rain. They parted ways at the rundown pavilion. Qian Pingan rode south alone. He swapped his thick azure cotton robe for a thin and fitting azure shirt. Qian Pingan arrived at Green Parasol City, one of the 4 major border cities of Bamboo Scroll Lake, without a hitch. Green Parasol City was a force on the border of Bamboo Scroll Lake, and it was often the case that the more significant the events in Bamboo Scroll Lake, the more quiet and peaceful the city would appear. This applied to the local residents regardless of whether they were island masters, faction leaders, itinerant cultivators, or ordinary commoners. Right now was a time of such significance, with hidden undercurrents and winds of change sweeping through Bamboo Scroll Lake. At the same time, there was also Great General Su Gaoshan's stunning proclamation and act of provocation at Pond Water City. But why was this the case? Why did these sweeping changes instead bring peace and quiet? This was because the residents of Green Parasol City had no option but to accept their fate as dictated by the unstoppable trend of the world. This was especially the case for mortal humans born and raised in Green Parasol City. With how chaotic the world was right now, where could they flee to even if they had enough savings? Did they dare to leave? There were many delicacies in Green Parasol City. Qian Pingan visited a random steamed bun shop, and he was pleasantly surprised by how delicious the 2 steamed buns he purchased were. He bought another 2. And it had already been a very long time since Qian Pingan had eaten until he was 90% full. The shop was new, and the shopkeeper was also very young. He had only just graduated from a young boy into a young man. Business at his shop was also fairly good. While walking along the banks of Bamboo Scroll Lake from Green Parasol City to Pond Water City, Qian Pingan obtained some other pieces of news. Compared to the Stonebrush Nation that was mired in war, news and rumors from the cities on the banks of Bamboo Scroll Lake appeared much closer to reality. More than half a year had passed at that familiar dock in Pond Water City, yet that large ship was still silently moored at the dock. Even though Cyan Gorge Island's Lu Jimao had comprehensively lost his grip on power, Qian Pingan's status as a top-level guest elder of Cyan Gorge Island was still relatively valuable and respected. Qian Pingan left his horse at an inn, paying them some silver to keep his horse fed. When the Big Dipper looked like the handle of a wine jar, that signified the arrival of great heat, the 12th solar term. The entire Bamboo Scroll Lake was like a big steamer, with hot air rising into the sky. It was very difficult to imagine that Bamboo Scroll Lake had still been a sheet of snow white when he had departed back then. Qian Pingan rowed a boat by himself back to Cyan Gorge Island. After docking his boar and stepping ashore, Chuan Ping'an walked past the mountain entrance where the old gatekeeper was still as lethargic and glum as always. However, the old cultivator immediately smiled when he saw bookkeeper Chun returning to Cyan Gorge Island. It appeared as if nothing had affected the leisurely lifestyle of this old cultivator. Not Lu Jimao's disappearance, not the destruction of Hengbo residence, and not Su Gaoshan's proclamation and act of throwing a whip into Bamboo Scroll Lake. Chuan Ping'an greeted the old gatekeeper and made some small talk with him before opening the door to his room. Nothing was amiss save for the extra layer of dust on everything. This was because Chuan Ping'an had said that there was no need to clean his room when he left Cyan Gorge Island. The first place Chuan Ping'an visited was Hengbo residence, a place that had already become ruins and would be impossible to rebuild in the future. He silently stood on the outskirts of the ruins for a while, and only then did he turn around to walk to the spring courtyard mansion that was still as extravagant as before. Cyan Gorge Island was lacking a leader right now, and Zhang Yi, who would have been able to just barely hold things together, had disappeared without a trace as well. As a local Golden Core tier cultivator, Tian Hujuan, Lu Jimao's most senior disciple, and the leader of Whitefish Island, had surprisingly decided to enter seclusion at this critical moment. In addition, Gukin had already lost his powerful flood dragon companion. There were secretive communications between the various forces right now, most notably between the high-ranking guest elders of the vassal islands and some of Lu Jimao's direct disciples. Each person had their own plan. Without Hengbo residents and Lu Jimao to suppress them from above, it was very likely that the spring courtyard mansion had appeared full of life and vigor during the past while. In reality, however, they were suffering quite a bit. There would always be someone more powerful to hold up the sky when it collapsed, but now that Lu Jimao was detained, who would be next in line to assume this responsibility? Regardless of how oblivious to the great trend the people in the spring courtyard mansion were, this was a concept that they were extremely clear about. Gu Qian's mother was already waiting at the entrance with two young and beautiful maidservants, who were also her most trusted subordinates. The spring courtyard mansion was at least capable enough to gather this intelligence. Gu Qian's mother briskly walked over to Chuan Ping'an, saying in a soft voice, "Ping'an, how have you become so skinny?" Chuan Ping'an sighed in his mind, but he still smiled and replied, "I was wandering around the Stone Brush Nation the entire time, so I often needed to live and eat in the wilderness. However, it wasn't too bad after I became accustomed to it." "Where's Gu Qian?" Gu Qian's mother smiled and replied, "After you left Cyan Gorge Island, he developed a fondness for strolling around the island by himself. He's probably run off to mess around somewhere again. He can't change his bad habits, and he's been ever since he was little. I always needed to yell for him to come home whenever it was time to eat. However, this won't work anymore. Can wanders too far away now, so he won't be able to hear me regardless of how loudly I yell. Your auntie wasn't very accustomed to this in the beginning." Chuan Ping'an nodded and said with a smile, "Then I'll wait for him here. I need to leave Bamboo Scroll Lake right away after I discuss some matters with him." "Are you in that much hurry?" Gu Qian's mother asked in disappointment. Chuan Ping'an nodded in response. Gu Qian's mother accompanied Chuan Ping'an and chatted with him, mostly recollecting the bitter past and reminiscing the sweet times. She talked about the trivial household affairs in Clay Vase Alley and Apricot Blossom Alley back then. Meanwhile, Chuan Ping'an also told her a little about Ma Kuxuan's current state. Gu Qian's mother couldn't help but sigh with emotion, saying that she would have never imagined that the stupid little boy who was always bullied by others would become as impressive as he was now. However, it was a shame that the barb-tongued Granny Ma, the most foul-mouthed in town, was unable to live long enough to witness her grandson's incredible transformation. She seemingly became emotional as she said this, and turned around to wipe away a tear with her silk handkerchief. They waited for approximately 1 hour before Gu Qian slowly wandered back to the spring courtyard mansion. When he saw his mother and Chuan Ping'an waiting at the door, Gu Qian, as tall as a young man from the northern regions, didn't pick up his pace to hurry over. It was very easy for people to forget the true age of this chaotic demon of Bamboo Scroll Lake. After arriving at the door, Gu Qian greeted his mother before staring at Chuan Ping'an and saying in a quiet voice, "You've come back." Chuan Ping'an nodded and replied, "I've already heard about the matters that took place in Cyan Gorge Island. There are a few things that I want to say to you." Gu Qian's mother had already tactfully taken her leave. Chan Ping'an walked with Gu Kan to the ruins of Hengbo residence, saying slowly, "The more chaotic the situation, the more one needs to remain composed. Agitation will lead to mistakes, so becoming agitated is the least desired outcome." Gu Kan nodded in understanding. Oriole Island's Yuan Yuan has already pledged his loyalty to the Great Li Empire. Are you aware of this? Chan Ping'an asked. Gu Kan nodded again and replied, I heard about it. Nothing in the world can be kept secret forever. After I met with you last time, Lu Kaisang never visited me again. And it was actually Han Jingling and Huang He who especially came to Cyan Gorge Island to visit me following Su Gaoshan's appearance and Lu Jimao's capture. Huang He even wanted to enter your room to take a look, but I rejected his request. His expression became quite dark at the time. Chan Ping'an shot a glance at Gu Kan. Gu Kan smiled and said, I know now that I'm not very smart, but I'm not too stupid either, am I? Chan Ping'an nodded and replied, There's no need to feel disappointed in people like Han Jingling and Huang He. To do so would be stupid. At the same time, there's no need to feel disappointed in Lu Kaisang. To do so would be lacking smarts. The two of you are true friends, so since that's the case, you should put yourself in his shoes to consider his current situation. Lu Kaisang also belongs to a force and has his own responsibilities, so true friends should be more considerate of each other. The world is complicated, so don't dream about everything being perfect. It's naturally the best if things are perfect, but if they aren't, then save your feelings for later. Perhaps you'll experience the best friendship someday in the future. At that time you can enjoy your friendship as if it's aged fine wine. Gu Kan remained silent for a moment before asking, Chan Ping'an, is it too late for me to listen to your principles and reasonings now? Chan Ping'an shook his head and replied, No, it's not too late. But I'm still the same Gu Kan as before, so what should I do? Gu Kan asked. Any small improvement is improvement, and learning one extra principle is one extra principle, Chan Ping'an said. The two of them didn't say anything else, silently walking to the ruins of Hengbo residence just like that. Do you want to leave Bamboo Scroll Lake with me? Chan Ping'an asked. You'll still be able to return in the future like I'm doing right now. Then what about my mother? Gu Kan asked. Chan Ping'an didn't offer a response. He was simply giving Gu Kan a choice. Gu Kan shook his head and replied, I know you're doing this for my sake, but I can't leave Bamboo Scroll Lake with you. I won't feel at ease if I leave. Even if I can't do anything by staying here, leaving just will leave a sour taste in my mouth. I won't be able to forgive myself. I've already betrayed your trust, and I let the small catfish down as well. I can't let my mother down too. However, I won't regret my decision. You can scold me if you want, Chan Ping'an. Chan Ping'an didn't force a choice onto Gu Kan, nor did he scold Gu Kan. Gu Kan found this slightly strange. Chan Ping'an held his hands inside his opposite sleeves, looking at the puzzled Gu Kan as he said quietly, Have I ever scolded the snotty little kid from Clay Vase Alley? Gu Kan smiled when he heard this. He also started to cry. So this was how it was. Chan Ping'an's principles were actually this simple.